Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. In the summer of 2018, I took a trip to La Veta, Colorado, to visit my sister. She had moved into this tiny house at the base of the Rockies, and I figured it was the perfect escape after my messy divorce. The town felt cozy the moment I arrived. Just a few streets, friendly nods from strangers, that kind of place. I remember breathing in that mountain air, feeling like maybe I'd finally caught a break. My sister kept saying how the clean air and open spaces were good for the soul, so I tried to let myself believe that. On my second day there, she suggested a short hike. There was this trail she said was easy, just behind her house, something even a city guy like me could handle. I'm not a hiker, but I said yes. I just wanted to clear my head, maybe sweat out some of that lingering anxiety. We set off around mid-morning. The trail started out simple. Wide path, tall pines on both sides, that fresh scent of damp earth. We chatted about nothing in particular, just enjoying the quiet. After a while, the path got narrower, and the trees seemed taller, blocking out more of the light. It got strangely dim, even though it was still pretty early. We must have taken a wrong turn, because at some point we realized there were no more signs or markers. The forest got thicker, and the silence turned weird. Not normal silence, more like a heavy stillness that made my ears ring. Even our footsteps sounded strange, muffled. I remember feeling this uneasy pressure in my chest, like the air had changed. Suddenly, my sister froze. I saw her eyes lock onto something ahead. There was a figure, way taller than any person should be, maybe 8 feet high. It stood there, half hidden behind some branches. Dark, matted hair covered its body, and its shoulders were broad, much broader than a human's. It wasn't shaped like a bear, too upright, too long-limbed. Its arms hung low, and I swear I saw long, thick fingers. When our eyes met, I felt like the blood drained from my face. Its eyes were dark, kind of shiny, but not like an animal's. There was something else there, something thinking. My heart was going insane. My sister took a step back, her face pale. I should have done the same, but something kept me rooted. I remember thinking, what am I looking at? This can't be real. We just stood there, nobody moving. It didn't lunge at us. Instead, it tilted its head, sort of curious. I had no clue what to do, so I slowly reached into my backpack. I had these dried apricots stashed away, a small snack I'd brought. My hands were shaking, but I managed to hold out the packet. I guess I did it to show I wasn't a threat. To my shock, the creature stepped closer. The way it moved was off. Its steps were heavy but deliberate. When it got close, I almost choked on my own breath. This thing was massive and smelled like damp fur mixed with old leaves. It reached out gently and took a few apricots from my hand. I could hear it breathing as it chewed, like a quiet huffing sound. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My sister caught my eye, silently begging me to back away. Her face said everything. We need to get the hell out of here. I started to step back, real slow, not wanting to startle it. That's when something cracked a branch behind us. My sister turned and let out a stifled gasp. I followed her gaze. There were more shapes moving between the trees, tall and hulking, just at the edge of my vision. 1, 2, I think 3 more of them. I only caught glimpses, a shoulder here, an arm there. They were circling around us, not rushing in, just closing that comfortable distance. My whole body tingled with fear. I knew we had to leave. My sister was backing up faster now, and I tried to do the same. The first one, the one that took the apricots, lowered its head slightly, but didn't try to stop us. I wasn't sure if it was letting us go or if it was deciding what to do next. The air was thick with this tense silence, except for the rustling leaves and my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. I didn't bother with any more attempts at kindness. I just started moving backward, keeping my eyes on that creature. My sister grabbed my arm, and I could feel her trembling. Then, at some invisible signal, we both turned and started walking away, then jogging, then running. We stumbled over roots and loose stones, scratching our arms on branches as we crashed through the brush. I could hear heavy steps following us, or maybe it was just my pulse pounding in my head. Every snap of a twig made me flinch. I was sure they were right behind us, but I didn't dare look back. Somehow, we found our way out of that dense part of the forest and back onto a recognizable trail. The trees thinned, and sunlight hit our faces. We ran until our legs burned. When we reached my sister's backyard, we nearly collapsed on her porch, gasping for breath. We locked the door behind us and just sat there, not saying a word for a while. My shirt was soaked in sweat, and my sister's eyes were watering, but she wasn't crying exactly, just in that state of disbelief and shock. We never mentioned it to anyone in that town. I doubt anyone would have believed us. What would we even say? We saw something that shouldn't exist, something that looked straight into our eyes and took food from my hand. And then there were more of them, watching us from the shadows. I still can't explain it. I remember every detail, the smell, the shape of its hand, the feeling of those eyes on me. But I have no idea what they were or why they let us leave. All I know is that since that day, every time I see a dense patch of forest or smell that damp, earthy scent, I get a shiver down my spine. And I still have no clue what really happened out there. It just ended, like something from another world slipped back into the shadows, leaving me to wonder if I even saw it at all. Story 2. Last summer, around late July 2019, I took a last-minute trip up to Olympic National Park, near Forks, Washington. I'd been working in Portland for months, glued to a computer screen, feeling completely drained. I thought a few days hiking and camping on my own might clear my head. The first 2 days went by smoothly. I set up camp in a quiet spot, saw some deer, and listened to birds. The evenings were peaceful, and besides the rain here and there, I didn't face any trouble. It felt good to disconnect. On the third day, though, things started to get really weird. It had been raining hard that morning. I remember I'd waited it out under a canopy of trees, just standing there, listening to the heavy drops on leaves and trying not to shiver. Once the rain slowed, I stepped forward into the mud. That's when I noticed these enormous footprints right near my boots. At first I actually laughed a bit, thinking maybe I was looking at some distorted animal tracks caused by the rain, but they weren't like any tracks I knew. They were basically giant human-like footprints, much bigger than any normal boot print, and spaced in a way that suggested whatever made them was heavy and tall. I felt a jolt of nervous energy run through my body. I tried telling myself it was probably some weird shape made by overlapping impressions, or maybe a bear's foot just looked odd in the mud. Still, I couldn't shake that feeling in my gut that something about those prints was off. I stood there for a while, scanning the surroundings. The forest was quiet, just the drip of water and an occasional rustle of leaves. I didn't see anyone else around. Eventually, I moved on, trying not to obsess over it. A bit later, I was climbing up a gentle slope through a patch of trees. The fog was rolling in, typical for that area, and it gave everything a grayish blur. That's when I spotted something out of place. At first, I saw just a tall, dark shape, standing between two large trunks. It looked upright, definitely not an animal on all fours. It was tall and lanky, but broad at the shoulders. It stood there for a moment, not moving much. I actually froze, heart pounding, and just tried to process what I was seeing. It wasn't a bear, Bears don't stand like that for long, and the shape was too slim, too human-like. But it sure as hell wasn't a person either. No normal human out there alone would be that tall and move that quietly. I didn't call out. I just stood, gripping a branch for balance, my backpack straps digging into my shoulders. The figure took a step, and that step was almost silent. It was like it knew exactly where to place its foot. I caught a glimpse of long arms and a kind of dark, shaggy outline. For a split second, it tilted its head like it was studying me. Then it moved off, disappearing behind the trees with this unbelievable grace. I could hear a few branches lightly creak, but that was it. No big crashing noise, no heavy stomp. It was there, and then gone. My brain was spinning. I knew about the folklore. Everyone's heard Bigfoot stories, but I'd never seriously believed any of it. Still, I couldn't ignore what I saw. It didn't fit into any normal category. I stood there shaking, trying to make sense of it. Part of me wanted to chase after it or call out, but something deeper in me said that was a terrible idea. I felt this intense sense of being watched, like every move I made was under scrutiny. It felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I backed away slowly, trying to remember where my camp was. As the afternoon went on, the rain started up again, a steady drizzle that made the ground even more slippery. I tried heading back to camp, avoiding areas that felt too quiet or too dense. The air was thick with moisture, and every sound, my boots on wet leaves, the slight squeak of my backpack straps, seemed magnified. Every now and then, I thought I heard something behind me, not close, but maybe 30 or 40 feet away. When I stopped, it would stop. I tried to spot something between the thick ferns and dark trunks, but never caught another clear glimpse. Just the feeling that something was there, trailing me, making sure I left. Once at my campsite, I felt a bit safer, though not by much. The place looked normal. Nothing was disturbed. My tent was closed. My food bag hung from a tree branch. But I still felt like I was being observed. I started packing up my gear in the drizzle, hands shaking, trying not to drop things. It wasn't dark yet, but the clouds and the canopy made it feel late. I decided I would just leave. I didn't care about finishing my planned route. I just wanted to get out of those woods. Before actually leaving, I stepped behind my tent to make sure I hadn't left any trash. That's when I saw fresh impressions in the mud, right near a fern bed. They were similar to the earlier ones I'd found, huge and human-like, pressed deep into the soft ground. They were close to my tent, way too close. I realized that whatever I saw earlier must have been there while I was out. The thought made my stomach twist. I could picture it standing just behind my campsite, watching me pack, deciding what to do. The idea that it might still be around, silently observing, was enough to make my hair stand on end. I didn't say a word, didn't make any sudden moves. I just gathered my stuff, pulled on my rain jacket, and started walking back towards the trail that led out of there. Every rustle of branches, every drip of water sounded like something creeping up on me. But I didn't run. I forced myself to keep a steady pace, feeling this heavy tension, like if I panicked and ran, something bad would happen. I can't explain it, but I just knew I shouldn't run. The whole time, I felt that presence. Not right next to me, but not far either. Eventually, after what felt like hours, but was probably just one long, anxious hour, I reached a more traveled path. I passed a couple of hikers who nodded at me. I didn't say anything to them, just acted normal, even though my heart was still pounding. I just wanted to get to the ranger station, to my car, to anywhere with more people. I felt an odd sense of relief once I heard distant voices and spotted a parking lot through the trees. It was like a spell broke as soon as I stepped onto the asphalt. No one asked me anything. The rangers at the station just gave a friendly nod. I thought about telling them, but what would I say? that I saw something huge in the forest and felt hunted by it. They'd probably just smile and chalk it up to my imagination, or maybe confusion in the rain. Back in my car, I sat there for a long moment, engine off, just breathing and trying to calm down. I looked up at the tree line and imagined that figure still in there, blending into the shadows, watching me leave. I knew I couldn't explain what I saw. It didn't act like a normal animal. It didn't run away like a scared bear. It observed me, almost with intelligence, and then vanished without a sound. The footprints were real. I know what I saw. And those few moments I stood face to face with it were too vivid to forget. I remember the shape of its shoulders, the way it tilted its head, the silent footsteps. I drove off, feeling shaken and oddly sad. I still don't know what that creature was. I can't prove it, but I know what I saw was not human, and it wasn't a known animal. I've read stories before, and always found them hard to believe. Now I understand why people don't talk about it much. No one wants to be labeled as crazy. But I was there. I felt it. I can't unsee that silhouette. I can't forget those footprints near my tent. That's it. I don't have some grand conclusion. It happened. I left. And that's all. Even now, when I think about it, I feel uneasy. Like part of me is still in that forest, soaked and nervous, trying to stay calm, while something impossible watched from behind the trees. I still have no explanation. It's just one of those things that happened and then ended, leaving me with nothing but questions. Story 3. I remember it so clearly. It's been years now, but every detail still pops into my mind like it happened yesterday. Back in 2017, after some rough patches in my personal life, I decided to head out to the Great Smoky Mountains near Gatlinburg, Tennessee. I knew these trails like the back of my hand. I'd been hiking there for years. I wasn't looking for anything extraordinary. I just wanted some time alone, away from everything, breathing fresh mountain air and clearing my head. For most of the trip, that's exactly what I got. Just the usual quiet trails and the steady crunch of my boots on the forest floor. It wasn't until the third afternoon, sometime before dusk, that things got weird. I was walking along a section of trail that I'd been on countless times. The weather was calm, the wind was barely noticeable, and everything looked perfectly normal. But then the forest itself seemed to shift. It's hard to explain. It started as a feeling. The kind of feeling where you suddenly realize all the birds have stopped chirping. I swear, the silence was so total it felt unnatural. The only sound I could hear was the slight rustle of leaves as I moved. I remember stopping and listening, just standing there, wondering if maybe there was a predator nearby. Sometimes bigger animals can make the smaller ones go quiet, you know. But I didn't see anything. No bears, no deer, not even squirrels darting around. It was like everything had fled. I tried to shake it off and kept going. But maybe 20 minutes later, I started noticing these tracks in the dirt off to the side of the trail. They were weird. They sort of looked like footprints, like bare human feet, but way too large, and the toes seemed spaced oddly, almost like they were splayed out. I remember kneeling down, touching the soil, trying to figure out if someone was playing a prank. But the prints seemed real, deep impressions, not just some casual fake job. The distance between the steps was also too long for a normal person. It didn't make any sense. I felt a chill, but I kept moving forward, not wanting to stand around too long. I tried to convince myself that maybe someone out here was just messing around. Or maybe I was seeing distorted prints from a large bear's hind paws. But I knew what bear tracks looked like, and these just weren't right. As daylight started to fade, I found myself in a more remote area, where the trees grew tighter and the underbrush was thicker. I was moving slower, carefully placing my steps because the last thing I needed was to twist an ankle miles from help. That's when I heard something high above me. It was this sharp crack, like a branch snapping under weight. It didn't sound like a falling limb. It sounded like something heavy stepping on it. I jerked my head up, aiming my flashlight into the dense canopy. For a second, I caught a glimpse of something dark shifting between the branches. I'm not talking about a small figure. This was big, much bigger than any raccoon or owl. Whatever it was, it moved too quickly, disappearing behind thick leaves. I felt a spike of adrenaline. I stood there, heart pounding, shining my light in every direction. I'm not an anxious person by nature, but at that moment, I felt exposed, like something was watching me. I tried to rationalize. Maybe a large bird, a big cat. But deep down, I knew it was something else. Something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the sight. It was the feeling I got. The sense that I was being observed by something that didn't belong on a trail so familiar to me. I pressed on, deciding I would head back toward my car sooner than planned. As I moved, I started to notice subtle things. The occasional faint snap of a twig, a rustle in the brush just beyond the reach of my flashlight. Every time I stopped to look, nothing. No eyes shining back, no visible shapes, just empty, dark forest. But the hair on the back of my neck wouldn't settle down. Then I actually saw it. Through a gap in the trees, maybe 30 yards ahead, I spotted a figure. Tall, extremely tall. I'm not a small guy, but this thing, even at a distance, looked like it would tower over me. It was partially covered by brush, but I could see dark, matted hair all over its body. The shoulders were broad, impossibly broad, and the limbs looked powerful. It wasn't shaped exactly like a human, but it wasn't shaped like a bear either. It stood upright. I remember holding my breath, my chest tightening. I aimed my flashlight straight at it, and for a split second, I caught the reflection of eyes. They weren't glowing like an animal's caught in a beam, but there was definitely a sense of intelligence behind them. I couldn't tear my gaze away. And then, as quickly as I saw it, it shifted behind some thick pines and was gone. No sound, no roar, nothing dramatic. It was like a ghost slipping back into the darkness. I stood there, my legs trembling, gripping my flashlight and my trekking pole so hard my knuckles hurt. I wanted to call out, to yell something, but I couldn't make my voice work. My brain went into overdrive. Should I turn around and run? Should I keep going, pretending I didn't see that? Every instinct told me I shouldn't run. I've learned that from wilderness safety rules. Running can trigger a chase response in predators. So I just stood there, trying to slow my breathing, trying to think. After what felt like minutes, but was probably only a few seconds, I decided I had to keep moving toward my car. I moved quietly, one foot in front of the other, scanning every inch of the shadows ahead. Every so often, I thought I caught glimpses of a shape moving parallel to me, keeping pace just beyond the tree line. I never got a clear view again, but I had the sense it was still there. It was this constant, hovering presence. I could almost feel its stare. I don't think I've ever felt so powerless, so uncertain about what was lurking just out of sight. The forest was still silent, no frogs, no crickets, no nothing, just me and this thing. I forced myself to keep walking. My body was covered in cold sweat, and even though I was trying to move quietly, every little noise I made sounded like a scream in that unnatural silence. I was desperate to see some sign of normality, another hiker, a familiar landmark, something. But I was still deep enough into the woods that I knew it would be a while before I got back to a more traveled path. At some point, I can't say exactly when because my sense of time was all messed up, I realized I no longer felt it there. The presence, the heavy stare, seemed to fade. The forest started to feel more alive again. I heard a distant call of some night bird, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. Gradually, that choking silence released its grip. I didn't want to stop and look behind me. I just kept moving until I finally broke through to a more open section of the trail. By the time I got back to my car, it was well after dark. My legs were shaking, and my mind was racing. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I mean, who would believe me? I just drove back to my motel, locked the door, and sat there with the lights on, trying to piece it together. I knew what people say about these mountains, the rumors, the folklore, the supposed sightings of something that shouldn't exist. But I'd always dismissed that stuff as nonsense. Now, I'm not so sure. All I know is that something followed me in those woods, something that stood upright, had massive footprints, and knew how to keep itself hidden. It didn't attack me or hurt me, but it let me know it was there. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still see that silhouette slipping behind the trees, and I can still feel that eerie silence pressing down on me. I never returned to that exact spot. The memory still makes my skin crawl. I've thought about it 1,000 times since then. I can't explain it, and that's what bothers me most. This thing, whatever it was, came into my life without warning, freaked me out beyond anything I've ever experienced, and then vanished like it never existed. There's no neat ending here, no comforting conclusion. It just happened, and then it was over. I'm left with nothing but the memory and the unsettling realization that there's more out there than I'd ever imagined. Story 4. I remember this like it was yesterday, even though it's been years since it happened. Back in the fall of 2018, I was traveling around the country in my old van, stopping wherever I felt like. I ended up near Redwood National Park, close to Oric, California. I'd always wanted to see those massive trees. There's something about those ancient giants that drew me in. So I pulled into a small campground, a pretty basic place, nothing fancy, just a clearing with some picnic tables and a fire ring or two, right under those towering sequoias. It was quiet, damp, the ground covered in layers of soft needles. The air smelled earthy, kind of fresh but heavy at the same time. I remember that evening clearly. I was cooking a simple burger on my portable stove. It was late afternoon. The sun was trying to cut through the tall canopy, leaving the campground in a dim sort of light. Off to the side, there was this older man sitting alone. He didn't have much gear with him, just a small tent and a chair. He kept staring at the trees, barely glanced at me. When he finally approached, he was calm, but serious. He warned me about wandering off after dark, mentioning creatures that come out when it's pitch black. He spoke quietly, like someone who knew more than he wanted to share. I just nodded, trying not to offend him, but I honestly thought it was some local legend or a way to scare tourists. I thanked him and figured that was that. The next day, I decided to take a more secluded trail. I was feeling confident and curious. The forest was unbelievably still. It's one thing to see pictures of these trees, but standing among them is different. They're enormous, ancient. The silence was deep, broken only by the occasional rustle of something moving through the underbrush, maybe a squirrel or a small bird. The ground was soft, and the air felt humid. There were ferns and moss everywhere, patches of green on green, and beams of light trying to push through the canopy. After a while, I noticed I hadn't seen another hiker for hours. As I went further, the woods got denser. The path wasn't super well marked out there. I found myself stepping over fallen logs and pushing through thicker brush. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I'd crossed into territory that doesn't get many human visitors. At some point, I realized how quiet it had become. No distant car noise, no other campers' voices, just a faint dripping sound of moisture falling from leaves, and maybe my own breathing. I could feel my heart beating a little faster, but I tried to shake it off. I mean, it's just a forest, right? Then I heard something heavy stepping on branches not too far away. The kind of sound you know isn't just a bird or a raccoon. It sounded like a large animal, like a bear maybe. I stopped in my tracks and listened. It was this slow, deliberate crunching, I tried to see through the foliage, but everything was shadows and leaves. I called out. I don't know what I expected, maybe to scare it off or to alert another hiker that I was there, but there was no human voice in return. Instead, the steps just paused. I stood there, and after a few seconds, I heard a faint movement again, like it was circling around me, staying out of sight. I took a few careful steps backward, trying not to make too much noise. The adrenaline started creeping in, and I felt that weird tingling in my spine. I decided maybe I'd gone far enough and should head back, but as I turned, I caught a glimpse of something between two massive trunks. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The shape was tall, really tall, and covered in dark, matted hair. For a split second, I actually thought it was a person wearing some kind of fur coat, but as it moved, I realized this was no human. It was too big, too broad, the shoulders too massive. Its arms seemed long, and it just stood there, partially hidden, watching me. I've seen bears before, and this wasn't a bear. The face was different, more, I don't want to say human, but it had something human-like in the way it looked at me. The eyes weren't dull animal eyes. They seemed curious, maybe even cautious. I tried to keep my cool, but I could feel the panic rising inside me. Every muscle in my body tensed. I wanted to run, but something told me that running would be a bad idea. I just slowly stepped back again, not even taking my eyes off it for a second. It tilted its head to the side, almost like it was trying to figure out what I was. It didn't make any noise, no growl, no howl, nothing, just stood there observing. My heart was pounding. I thought of that old man's warning the night before. He must have known. He must have seen something like this himself. I had no clue what to do. Part of me wanted to speak, say something like, "I'm not here to harm you." But my throat was dry, and honestly, I didn't want to trigger any reaction I couldn't handle. After what felt like an eternity, the figure just moved slightly, blending back into the foliage. I could see it stepping away, vanishing behind a wide trunk. In that moment, I didn't stick around to investigate. I backed up, step by step, until I felt like it was safe enough to turn around and walk normally. I tried not to run, but as soon as I got far enough that I couldn't sense it anymore, I walked faster and faster until I was almost jogging back. When I finally made it back to the campground, it was late afternoon. I was sweaty, my clothes damp from exertion and nerves. That old man was sitting there again near his tent. He looked at me, just nodded slowly. It was like he could read my face. I didn't say anything because what could I say? I saw a giant hairy creature in the woods. It would sound insane, and I didn't have any proof. No photos, no footprints I could show him. Just my word, and my shaking hands, and my heart still racing. I packed up my van the next morning, not wanting to linger. The old man was gone by then. I thought about reporting it to the park rangers, but what would I say? I saw something huge and hairy that vanished without a trace. They'd just think I was another crackpot who believed in Bigfoot. Plus, the creature hadn't really threatened me. It just observed me. Still, the thought of going back into those woods made my stomach turn. I decided it was best to move on. Even now, years later, I can still picture that creature's silhouette between the giant redwoods. The memory still sends a chill through me. The feeling of being watched by something that shouldn't be there, something that doesn't fit into any explanation I know, is something I can't shake off. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking about those eyes and how quietly it stood there just considering me. It's like the forest around Redwood holds secrets I'll never understand. I kept quiet about it for a long time. I guess talking about it here is my way of letting it out. I still have no idea what I saw. All I know is that I was there, and I'm not the kind of person to make this stuff up. To this day, I can't explain it. It happened, and then it was gone, and I've been left trying to put it out of my mind ever since. Story 5. I remember that day in 2020 as if it happened yesterday. I had been staying at my dad's old property south of Branson, Missouri for a few weeks by then. He owned a patch of land with a beat-up mobile home sitting on it, surrounded by thick forest. I'd quit my office job and needed some time to clear my head, and that remote spot felt like a good place to reset. No real neighbors, no traffic, just endless trees and my own thoughts. The first couple of weeks had been weirdly peaceful. Just me fixing small things around the trailer, chopping some wood, going for slow walks. But that morning, something felt off as soon as I woke up. I stepped outside just before dawn. Usually, the early morning stillness would calm me, but not this time. The air seemed heavier, and there was a strange smell. It reminded me of damp soil mixed with something sour, like a wet animal that hadn't bathed in a long time. I tried to ignore it, assuming maybe a raccoon or something had been messing around near the property. But my gut told me this wasn't normal. It was too quiet. No birdsong, no rustle of leaves, nothing. Just that heavy silence and the smell. I walked around the perimeter of the trailer and noticed these odd impressions in the soft dirt near the western side. The ground was kind of muddy from recent rain, and there were these footprints, large, broad, with a shape that kind of looked human but way too big and too wide. 5 toes, if I remember correctly, but not defined like a human foot. Just odd. The depth suggested something really heavy, heavier than any person I've ever known. I knelt down, ran my hand lightly over one of the prints, and felt my skin prickle with fear. I'd seen bear tracks before, though not often, and these were nothing like that. Bears have a distinctive shape to their prints, and these were definitely different. More elongated. It was almost like a massive barefoot person had walked by, but out there, that made no sense. I got that weird feeling again, like I was being watched. My back tightened. I scanned the tree line. The trees to the north grew closer together, and that area always made me uneasy, but I'd never really believed in anything like Bigfoot or whatever people say lurks in the woods. Still, something was telling me to keep my guard up. With the sun rising, I decided to follow the tracks a bit, just to see where they led. They went from the west side of the trailer and looped north, disappearing into denser underbrush where I didn't normally go. I hesitated for a long moment. I almost turned back right then, but curiosity got the better of me. Maybe I shouldn't have followed them, but I felt this pull. I wanted to confirm that I wasn't losing it, that I wasn't just making something up in my head. As I pushed into that northern patch, the forest felt different. The canopy was thicker, the ground cluttered with fallen branches and thick layers of leaves. It got darker, even though the day was getting brighter. Each step I took seemed to make way too much noise. Every twig snap sounded like a gunshot to me, and the smell got stronger, more pungent, like sweat and rot mixed together. I walked slowly, trying not to break more branches, but the undergrowth was dense. After maybe 10 minutes, I paused. I listened. Still no birds. Nothing. Just my own breathing. Then I heard something move about 30 yards ahead of me. A heavy step, a crack of wood. I strained to see through the leaves. I thought I caught a glimpse of something tall, covered in brownish hair or fur, stepping behind a thick oak tree. My heart pounded in my ears. My eyes watered, trying to focus. Whatever it was big, taller than any person I'd ever seen in real life. The shoulders were broad, and there was a definite shape of a head and upper body, not bear-like at all. It was upright. It moved like a man, but it was not a man. I froze. My hands were shaking. Part of me wanted to call out, but I knew how stupid that would be. Another part of me wanted to run, but I couldn't outrun something like that if it decided to chase me. For a long minute, I just stood there, barely breathing, listening. I heard it move again, stepping to the side. Then I saw half its face, just a split second as it peered around the trunk. Dark eyes, a flat, wide nose, a face framed by coarse hair. It blinked, and I swear it looked right at me. My stomach clenched. It wasn't roaring or growling. It was just observing me, and that was almost scarier than if it had charged right at me. It was intelligent. It knew I shouldn't be there. My legs finally cooperated enough to make me take a step back. The creature shifted slightly, and I thought I heard a low huffing sound. I didn't want to show aggression or fear, but I couldn't hide how terrified I felt. I backed up another step, and my shoulder brushed a branch, making a snapping noise. In that instant, the creature moved, quick, almost silent. I lost sight of it, and the rustling sound drifted away deeper into the forest. I was left standing there in this tense silence, heart pounding, sweat on my forehead. I didn't know if I should follow or run back. I felt foolish, even considering following it. There was no reason to stick around. I decided to head back to the trailer, keeping my eyes on the trees behind me for as long as I could. Halfway back, I could have sworn I heard something parallel me, keeping pace but out of sight. I didn't see it again, but that feeling of being tracked wouldn't leave me. Every few steps I'd stop and listen. Sometimes I'd pick up a faint crack of a twig off to my left, sometimes a faint breathy sound like someone exhaling hard. It never got closer than maybe a dozen yards. I never saw it again on the way back, but knowing it was there was enough to keep my heart racing. When I finally broke through the thicker brush and reached the clearing where the trailer sat, the sun was higher, and I could see everything clearly in the open space. I expected relief, but it never came. I still felt that presence. I hurried inside and locked the door, as if that flimsy lock would do anything against something that size. I stood by the small window, peeking out at the tree line. Then I saw movement again, just a flicker of something brownish-red darting between the trees. I couldn't get a clear look. There was a long stretch of time where I stayed inside, listening. Every so often, I'd hear a soft thud, like a branch hitting the ground, or a scraping sound along the side of the trailer. I tried to distract myself, checking my phone, no service of course, sipping water. My ears were tuned to every tiny sound. The trailer walls felt too thin, like cardboard. I considered grabbing the old rifle my dad kept, but I had no idea where he stored the ammo, and something about that felt wrong. This thing, whatever it was, didn't seem to be rushing in to hurt me. It was testing me maybe, or just letting me know it was around. By the time it was late afternoon, I had gathered enough courage to peek outside again. The smell was still lingering, that heavy, musky odor. I stepped onto the small porch and looked toward the forest. Nothing, just trees. The silence was unsettling. I tried to reason with myself that if it wanted to hurt me, it would have done it by now. Still, I felt exposed. The shadows were growing longer. I knew nightfall would come in a couple of hours, and I couldn't imagine being stuck here with that thing lurking around. Then, just before dusk, I heard a sound that turned my blood cold. It was a shrill, whistling cry from deep within the trees, followed by a heavy grunt. It was unlike any animal call I'd ever heard in those woods. Part scream, part howl, part something else entirely. I clenched my jaw and tried to stay calm, but my body was shaking. I yelled out a shaky, "Hey!" Just a loud shout, more out of desperation than anything else. My voice sounded small and pathetic. The woods answered me with silence. Minutes passed. I checked around the side of the trailer, walking slowly, every muscle tense. When I turned the corner, I saw something that I still can't fully explain. There were branches arranged in a strange pattern on the ground, like a rough symbol, or maybe just some random clutter. But it didn't look random to me. Some branches were broken and stuck into the soil at odd angles. Others were laid across them. It felt like a message, but I couldn't read it. I didn't touch it. I just backed away, keeping my eyes on that weird arrangement until I was safely back on the porch. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest got dark fast. I sat inside, the only light coming from a small lamp powered by the old generator. I tried to focus on something else, anything else, but I kept imagining those eyes watching me from just beyond the tree line. I was prepared to get in my truck and leave, but the truck was parked a good distance away, and I'd have to run across open ground to reach it. I decided to wait it out until morning. Eventually, the sounds outside diminished. The smell faded. The oppressive feeling lessened. Sometime in the night, I must have dozed off. When I woke up, everything felt strangely normal. I opened the door, and the morning air smelled clean and fresh. The branches on the ground were still there, but now they just looked like sticks. The footprints were less distinct, probably a bit dried out overnight. I didn't see or hear anything unusual, no sign of that towering figure. I can't explain it. One day of absolute terror and confusion, and then nothing, like it never happened. I stayed a bit longer on the property, though I never went back into that northern section of the woods. Nothing else strange occurred. Still, I know what I saw. I can't shake that feeling of being watched, of seeing that thing's face and knowing it was real. I never told anyone in town. Who would believe me? To this day, I still think about it and wonder what it was, why it showed itself, and why it left me alone after all that. I have no answers. It just started and ended without any explanation, like some bizarre chapter that closed as quickly as it opened. When I think about that day, I still get chills. I can't prove it, but I know what I experienced. Some things, I guess, are meant to remain a mystery. Story 6. I was staying at my uncle's old cabin near Leavenworth, Washington back in 2021. It was one of those places where the closest town is half an hour away, and the cabin's amenities barely went beyond a shaky water pump and a few hours of electricity if the old generator felt cooperative. I had come here for isolation, to get my head straight. The plan was simple. Chop some wood, heat water on the stove, maybe take short walks and clear my thoughts. Nothing fancy. That particular day started normally enough. I remember waking up before sunrise because I'd turned in early the night before. Without a phone signal or much to do after dark, I'd developed a habit of rising with the sun. My first sign that something was off came when I went outside to gather some kindling. The ground was still damp from the night's drizzle, and I noticed these weird tracks around the perimeter of the cabin. They weren't your standard boot prints or even animal paw prints. They looked like oversized human footprints, but with toes that seemed wider and deeper in the mud, almost like somebody had pressed their feet in carefully. I thought maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe I just didn't know much about local wildlife, but I couldn't shake the feeling that these prints felt deliberate. They were arranged in a loose semicircle around the cabin, like something or someone had been pacing there, watching. I tried not to dwell on it too much. I gathered my wood and went back inside, pushing the thought out of my mind. The morning passed quietly. I boiled some water, ate a basic breakfast, and sat by the window staring at the trees. It's funny how the silence that used to feel calm and peaceful started to feel heavier, like I was suddenly aware of every small rustle, every distant snap of a branch. Around midday, I stepped outside again, with the idea of taking a short walk down to a nearby stream. The air smelled different. It's hard to describe, but it was this sharp, rancid smell, as if something had rotted close by, or like wet fur that had never been washed. It just hung there. I walked a few steps in the direction of the tree line, but something made me stop. There was this awful tension in the air, like I wasn't supposed to go any further. I can't explain why I felt that way, but it felt almost like an unspoken warning. I decided to turn back and keep busy closer to the cabin. I started splitting the wood I had gathered, thinking that physical labor would clear my head. I was mid-swing with the axe when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A dull thud on the outer wall of the cabin, coming from the opposite side. It wasn't just a single knock, it was like something heavy brushing or pushing against the wood. I froze, the axe still raised above my head, and listened. Silence. Then, after what felt like an eternity, another thud. Not aggressive, not like something trying to break in, but more like a big creature testing its surroundings. I put the axe down quietly and crept around to the back of the cabin, heart pounding. I can't say what I expected to see. Maybe a bear or a moose, something normal. But I only managed a glimpse of something tall and dark, slipping between the dense pines. The silhouette looked too upright to be a bear. It moved smoothly, with a strange heaviness to its steps, and within seconds it vanished behind a cluster of fir trees. The smell hit me again, like something wild and unwashed, something that didn't belong near humans. My stomach tightened, and I realized my hands were shaking. I remember thinking I should call someone, but my phone had no signal out there. Even if it did, who was I going to call? The local police. Hey, I think there's a giant hairy figure creeping around. I knew how that would sound. Besides, it didn't seem to be attacking me. It was just there. I spent the next couple of hours trying to go about my day, but I couldn't relax. The woods felt hostile, like I was trespassing. Every time I stepped onto the small porch, I scanned the tree line. I caught myself listening for footsteps that never came, or waiting for that smell to drift by again. The cabin started feeling smaller and less secure, as if its thin wooden walls couldn't keep out whatever was lurking in those pines. As evening approached, I decided to lock up early. I closed the flimsy windows, dragged a chair in front of the door for good measure, and lit my small oil lamp. Without electricity, the darkness set in fast. That's when the fear really sank in. I was completely alone, in near total darkness, with something large and curious roaming outside. I could hear soft movements, the crack of twigs, a low rustling. Nothing came right up to the window, but I swore I heard slow, heavy breathing at one point, just outside, maybe leaning against the wall. My heart was pounding so loud, I'm surprised it didn't echo. I must have sat there for an hour, lamp flickering, staring at the door, expecting it to burst inward at any second. But it never did. After a while, the sounds grew distant. The smell disappeared. The woods fell silent again, as if whatever had been there had simply lost interest and moved on. The sudden normality of it all was almost more unsettling. It was like the forest had exhaled and gone back to pretending nothing had happened. I barely slept that night, drifting in and out of a nervous doze. By the time the first grey light of dawn seeped through the window, I'd decided I couldn't handle staying there any longer. The cabin was never meant to be comfortable, but now it felt like I didn't belong there at all. I packed my things in record time and left, not bothering with any morning chores. Driving down that gravel road, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing in the clearing behind me, watching me go. To this day, I have no idea what I encountered out there. I never saw its face clearly, never got a perfect look. But something was there, something big, something that stood on two legs and watched me from the trees. Nobody I've told really believes me. They say it must have been a bear or my imagination running wild from isolation. But I know what I felt, what I saw. That day still haunts me, and I can't explain it. One moment it was there, lurking, testing the boundary between its world and mine. And then it was gone, leaving only silence and the unsettling memory that I was not alone in those woods. Story 7. Back in 2019, I took a break from my office job and decided to spend a few days in Olympic National Forest near Port Angeles. I'd been on solo trips before, and it usually felt more like a small personal escape than any kind of extreme adventure. I had my gear, my hiking boots, and a simple plan: follow the established trails, do a bit of fishing, camp out under the stars, then head back refreshed. Nothing I hadn't done before. The first couple of nights were completely normal. I set up my tent not too far off one of the quieter trails, cooked some instant noodles over my small stove, listened to distant owls, and basically zoned out in a peaceful, familiar way. It was actually kind of perfect. No cell signal, no office noise, just me and the woods. It was on my third day that things started feeling off. I'd packed up camp early that morning and decided to push deeper into the forest. The trail wasn't as well marked in this area, and the vegetation looked thicker, older, and less touched by human presence. You know how you can sort of tell when a place doesn't get much foot traffic? Broken branches, leaves disturbed, the subtle signs that someone's been there before. None of that was present. It felt like I was stepping into a zone that nature kept for itself. At first, I just thought it was cool. The forest had this heavy quiet, like even the small animals were holding their breath. I remember adjusting my backpack and feeling a strange chill, not from cold, but from the sudden awareness that I might not be alone. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe my nerves were on edge because I'd lost sight of the main trail markers. But something else was nagging at me. It was like I could sense eyes on me, or sense something else's presence, but whenever I looked around, all I saw were trees and undergrowth. About midday, after following what I was pretty sure was a faint animal path, I came across a small clearing. Clearing might be too generous a word, more like a patch of ground with fewer trees, a spot where the sunlight managed to slip through and hit the ferns and moss below. But it was weirdly still. I'm talking about a silence so complete it made my ears ring. No wind, no rustling, nothing. I just stood there, scanning the perimeter, feeling this growing weight in my chest. This was not the peaceful quiet I'd enjoyed before. This felt charged, like I'd stepped into somewhere I didn't belong. Then I saw it. At the far edge of the clearing, partially hidden by shadow but definitely standing there, was something large and upright. It had this dark, matted hair all over, and it stood easily a couple of feet taller than me. I'm about 5'10", and this thing was looming. I swear I could see the shape of broad shoulders, long arms that hung a bit too low, and a face that wasn't quite like a bear's, but wasn't human either. We locked eyes, at least it felt that way. I couldn't see all the details of its face perfectly, but I knew it was looking right at me. Its eyes had this kind of depth, hard to explain, but it was more than an animal's wary stare. There was intelligence there, some kind of awareness that freaked me the hell out. I froze. I didn't scream, didn't run. My heart was pounding so hard I half expected it to give me away. But the creature didn't charge. It didn't roar or anything dramatic like that. It just stood, regarding me. I tried to make sense of it. Bear on hind legs, maybe? But the proportions were off. I've seen bears. I know what they look like upright. This was different. The fur was darker, longer. The silhouette was more human-like, but far too massive. It was just wrong. After what felt like forever, it tilted its head slightly, as if curious. That subtle movement made something in me snap. I stepped back slowly, trying not to break eye contact, trying not to show fear. My boots made a slight crunch on the forest floor, and I almost winced at how loud it sounded in that unnatural silence. The thing didn't follow immediately. Instead, it just took a few heavy steps sideways into deeper shade. Its movement was surprisingly fluid and quiet for something so large. Before I realized it, it was gone, melting into the forest like it had never been there. I stood there, dumbstruck, heart in my throat. My whole body tingled with adrenaline. After a few seconds, I started moving, slowly at first, then faster, back towards where I'd come from. My mind was racing with a million questions. What the hell had I just seen? I knew legends, I knew stories people shared, but I never believed them. Not really. But this wasn't a myth. It was right there, plain as day. I saw it. It saw me. I managed to find my way back towards the area I'd camped in the previous night. I was sweating like crazy, and every snap of a twig, every sudden bird call, made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see it following me, but I never spotted it again. Still, that feeling of being watched never fully went away until I was practically out of that part of the woods. By late afternoon, I'd packed up all my gear and started heading back down the trails towards my car. My initial plan was to stay another couple of days, but after that encounter I couldn't relax. It wasn't that it attacked me or even seemed aggressive, but the sheer shock of seeing something that shouldn't exist, or at least shouldn't be just walking around out there, was too much. I didn't want to push my luck. I figured it was best to leave and sort it out in my head somewhere safer. On the drive home, I kept replaying it in my mind, the strange silence, the shape, the way it moved. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled into its territory, maybe somewhere it hunts or rests, and I'd been tolerated for a moment, then let go. For all I know, it might have been curious, even benign, but the uncertainty scared me more than anything. Normally, if I see a bear or a cougar, I know the guidelines, I know what I'm dealing with, but this was different. This was beyond my frame of reference. I never told many people about it. The few times I hinted at it, I got the expected reactions. People laughed it off, or said I must have seen a bear from a weird angle. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. There was something massive and intelligent out there in the Olympic National Forest, something I can't explain away as a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. I don't know what it was doing that day, why it showed itself, or why it let me walk away, but I've accepted I might never get answers. Sometimes things just happen, and you're left with nothing but the memory and a pounding heart. That's it. That's the truth. It happened, and then it ended, leaving me with more questions than I'll ever be able to answer. I still think about it sometimes, and every time I do, the hair on the back of my neck stands up. I guess that's how it'll stay. Story 8. Back in 2016, before my life got tied up with more serious responsibilities, I used to head out alone into the Great Smoky Mountains near Bryson City, North Carolina, just for a quick getaway. I'd been going there for a couple of years, so I knew the trails pretty well, the steep climbs, the quieter clearings, the spots where I'd pitch my small tent and sleep under the stars without worrying too much. I never really expected anything out of the ordinary. The place felt almost like a second home where nature did its usual familiar thing. That year, on one particular trip, I decided on a 2-night stay. The first day and night were pretty normal. I set up my tent in a familiar clearing, ate a quick meal, and fell asleep to the usual sounds of insects and distant rustling. The second night, though, something was off right from the start. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, maybe around 2 or 3 a.m., with this weird feeling that something had snapped me out of sleep, but I couldn't pinpoint what. There were no obvious sounds. In fact, that was the strange part. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your ears strain because you expect at least the usual chorus of crickets or the distant whoosh of the wind through the leaves. Instead, it felt like I was inside some huge, empty building, like an old cathedral, where every tiny movement echoed in my head. I couldn't shake that feeling of being watched. It was just this overwhelming sensation that made my skin prickle. I got out of my tent, turned on my small flashlight, and shone it around the edge of the campsite. Nothing unusual, just trees, bushes, my gear. But something was making me uneasy, so after a few minutes of trying to spot something, I just gave up and crawled back into my sleeping bag. It took me a while to fall asleep again. I'm not sure if I ever really got back into a deep sleep. My brain stayed on alert, waiting for something else to happen. When morning came, I got up early and started to pack my things. That's when I noticed weird footprints in the dirt around my campsite. They were faint, but they were definitely there, and they were way bigger than any human footprints I'd ever seen. The shape was odd, too, not a neat, defined shape like a bear's paw. These looked more like giant, elongated human footprints with toes. It was unsettling enough that I actually crouched down and tried to figure out if I was just seeing things. Was it just the way the light hit the dirt? Was the ground uneven from my tent stakes? But as I looked, I realized these footprints formed a sort of path, coming from just beyond the clearing's edge and leading off into the deeper woods. And some of them were placed in a pattern that didn't make sense for a quadruped animal. It seemed like whatever made them was walking upright. I tried to stay rational. I thought maybe a hiker had passed by in the night, or maybe it was some weird trick of erosion. But the prints were large, like twice the size of my boot, and spaced strangely. Also, just above eye level, on a few thick branches, I noticed fresh breaks. Branches that should have been too strong and too high up for an animal my size to snap. They hung there at jagged angles, like something heavy had pushed past them. That's when I started to feel that same weird tension I'd felt the night before, that sense of not being alone, that there was something out there that definitely didn't fit the usual wildlife pattern. Still, I didn't want to freak myself out too much. I had another half-day of hiking planned before heading back. I packed my gear, kept my head down, and moved along the trail as quietly as I could. The entire time, though, I felt watched. It's hard to explain that feeling. It's like a pressure on the back of your neck, a feeling that every step you take might reveal something lurking just behind you. The forest felt heavier than usual. I found myself stopping often to listen, but it was always that same weird quiet. No birds, no squirrels scurrying, nothing. At one point, maybe a couple of hours into my hike, I saw something move between the trees to my left. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out details perfectly, but the size and shape didn't match anything I'd seen before in these woods. It stood upright and moved smoothly, but it was covered in dark, shaggy hair. It wasn't a bear on its hind legs. I've seen that before, and this looked different. It was taller and leaner, and the way it stepped was more controlled, like it had a sense of what it was doing, not just a bear rearing up for a second. I froze, trying not to panic. I didn't scream or try to run, because I wasn't even sure what I was dealing with. I knew if it was some large predator, running might trigger a chase. Instead, I just stood there, my heart pounding in my ears. The creature paused behind a cluster of trees and then turned its head slightly in my direction. Even though I couldn't see its face clearly, I could tell it knew I was there. It felt like it was sizing me up. I remember feeling this wave of cold anxiety flood my chest, but also a weird curiosity. It wasn't charging at me. It just stayed there, half hidden, like it was trying to understand what I was. We stood like that for maybe a few seconds, though it felt like hours, before it slowly stepped backward and disappeared behind a thicker patch of forest growth. It didn't bolt or panic. It just quietly melted away into the trees. I remember realizing I was holding my breath and then letting it out slowly, trying not to make any noise. After that, I decided that I wasn't sticking around any longer. Whatever that thing was, I didn't want a second, closer encounter. I changed course and headed back the way I came, even though it meant a longer walk out of the woods. Every snap of a twig under my boots made me wince. I was hyper-aware of everything, the sound of my own breathing, the rustling of my pack straps, even the sweat dripping down my neck. I kept glancing behind me, expecting to see it following, but nothing showed itself again. The weird part was that once I got closer to the edge of the forest, the normal sounds started to return. I began to hear distant bird calls and the whisper of wind. It was as if I had crossed some invisible boundary line between normal forest and something else entirely. By the time I reached the outskirts and saw the familiar signs of civilization, that oppressive silence was gone. It felt almost unreal, like stepping out of a bad dream. When I got back into Bryson City, I didn't really tell anyone the full story. I just said something vague about cutting my trip short because of bad weather. I guess I didn't feel like having people look at me like I was nuts. Still, I know what I saw. I know that something out there, something large and intelligent, stepped into my comfort zone, disrupted my idea of what was normal. Those footprints were real, those branches were snapped, and that figure I saw wasn't my imagination. To this day, I can't fully explain what happened, but I've never looked at those woods the same way. I still love nature, but that incident proved that there are things out there we don't understand, things that aren't interested in being found, but might watch you when you think you're all alone. It didn't threaten me. It didn't scream or attack. It just existed, out there, in a place I thought I knew so well. That's the part that gets under my skin the most. I was so sure I knew those mountains, and yet something living among those old trees reminded me that I don't know nearly as much as I think I do. Since then, I've often wondered if it's still out there, roaming those quiet corners where people rarely go, keeping its own secrets. I never went back to that exact spot, and I'm not sure if I ever will. But I'll never forget that day, and I'll never look at those dark, silent patches of forest without thinking about what might be standing just out of sight, watching. Story 9. I guess I just need to get this off my chest. Last summer, 2022, after a really stressful period at work, I decided to take a break and camp out in the Rocky Mountain National Park, near Estes Park in Colorado. I'd been there before, but always stuck to the common trails, surrounded by other campers and day trippers. This time, I wanted some real solitude, just me, nature, and time to breathe. I found a spot way off the beaten path, away from any main campsites. I set up my small tent, arranged my gear, and spent the first couple of days just enjoying the quiet. The place was beautiful, tall pines, that crisp mountain air, patches of melting snow, and a clear view of distant peaks. It felt perfect. On what I believe was my third day out there, I woke up feeling calmer than I had in a long time. After breakfast, I decided to explore a narrow trail that seemed less like an official path and more like a faint game trail. It led deeper into a part of the forest I hadn't seen before. There were no signs, no other footprints from hikers, just me and the tall, dark green conifers. I moved slowly and quietly, trying to listen to birds or spot deer. But something felt off. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. It wasn't the normal, peaceful silence you get in nature. This was the kind of silence where you feel like the whole forest is holding its breath. Even the wind seemed to ease off, as if it didn't want to make a sound. I remember stopping and thinking, this is weird. I've been in quiet woods before, but this was different. It made the hair on the back of my neck rise. I continued forward, but more cautiously now. That's when I noticed these footprints on the ground, in a patch of semi-dry mud near a small stream. At first glance, I assumed it could be bear tracks, but then I realized they looked more like huge, barefoot human prints. They were way too large to be mine, and the shape was distinctly human-like, just bigger and broader. They were spaced in a way that suggested whatever made them stood upright. I'm not a tracker or anything, but it was obvious these weren't normal. My heart started pounding. My first thought was maybe some giant guy was out here barefoot, which made zero sense. Another part of me wanted to just turn around and head straight back to camp. I don't know why, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed those footprints for maybe a couple dozen yards, staying behind trees and moving quietly. The silence grew even heavier, which didn't help my nerves. I was stepping carefully, trying not to snap twigs, hoping to see something that would make sense. Then, through the branches of some thick pines, I caught sight of something tall and dark, moving slowly away from me. It was covered in dark hair, maybe brown or black. It was hard to tell because of the dim light under the canopy. It moved smoothly on two legs, way taller than any person I've ever seen in real life. It was broad-shouldered, powerful-looking, but not clumsy. It had a certain grace, like it was completely at home out there. For a few seconds I just froze. I didn't even realize I was holding my breath. My mind was racing through all the explanations. A very large man in a ghillie suit, a bear standing on hind legs, something else entirely. But the shape, the way it moved, the quiet power it radiated, this wasn't a guy in a costume. It turned its head slightly, and I swear it looked right at me. I can't explain the feeling that gave me. Its eyes didn't shine like a cat's, but they had a kind of depth, like there was intelligence there, a consciousness. I felt like I was intruding, like I'd stumbled into its living room uninvited. I tried to stay calm. My heart was hammering so loud I thought it would hear it. For a few seconds, we just looked at each other. I wasn't sure if I should run or stand still. I didn't want to provoke it. It didn't charge at me or make any threatening moves. It just seemed to be assessing me. I can't say it looked friendly, but I didn't sense immediate violence either. It was more like it was just curious, or maybe even annoyed that I was there. Very slowly, I took a step back, then another. I raised my hands slightly, like I was trying to show I had nothing in them, nothing threatening. The creature tilted its head a bit, almost like it was trying to understand what I was doing. Then it just turned away and walked deeper into the forest, silent and calm. Within seconds, it vanished behind a cluster of trees and shrubs. I stood there, stunned, for what felt like minutes, but was probably only a few moments. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I walked back to camp, checking over my shoulder the whole time, expecting it to reappear, but it never did. When I got back to my tent, I realized I was sweating, even though it wasn't hot at all. My breathing was shallow, and my hands were shaking. Everything looked normal around my campsite, the same as I'd left it. Yet I felt like I'd crossed some invisible line, like I'd just confirmed something I never thought possible. I didn't stay another night. I packed up much faster than I'd planned and got out of there before the afternoon was over. I felt paranoid, constantly looking behind me as I hiked back to my car. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush made me flinch. But I saw nothing else, heard nothing strange. On the drive home, I kept replaying that moment in my head. I considered every rational explanation. A misidentification? Maybe. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. It wasn't just an animal. It felt too aware. I thought about reporting it to a park ranger, but what would I even say? They'd probably chalk it up to a bear or some prankster. And honestly, I'm not sure I want anyone poking around out there. It felt like I was lucky to leave without causing a scene. I haven't shared this with many people. I'm still not totally sure what to make of it. Part of me wants to go back with better gear, maybe a camera, but I also don't want to disturb whatever's out there. Another part of me wonders if I made it all up in my head, but then I remember those footprints, the way they pressed into the mud, and the way that figure moved so smoothly through the trees. I can't shake it. After that day, my perspective on what might be living out there changed. I can't explain it, and I'm not here to convince anyone. I still can't wrap my head around it, and I've learned to accept that I may never have a neat explanation. It happened, and then it was over, leaving me with nothing but a strange, uneasy memory and the feeling that the world's bigger and stranger than I ever imagined. Story 10. I remember it was sometime in mid-2021, and I had this idea stuck in my head. Just get in my car and drive. No set plan, no fixed destination, just head west and see where I'd end up. After a few days on the road, I found myself somewhere near Whitefish, Montana. The scenery around there is stunning, towering trees, distant mountains, and those wide open skies that make you feel both free and tiny at the same time. I had been cooped up in the car for too long, so I decided to stretch my legs and take a short hike before moving on. I picked a spot that seemed quiet and off the beaten path. There wasn't much to indicate a trail, just a narrow dirt line snaking deeper into the woods. The sun was still pretty high, so I figured I had enough daylight to wander for an hour or so. I parked my car, locked it, and stepped into the forest. At first it felt good. Fresh air, the smell of pine, a calm silence that made me feel like I'd left the chaotic world behind. There was a light breeze, and I could hear branches creaking softly overhead. But after maybe 30 minutes, something felt off. I'm not a seasoned outdoorsman, but I've done my share of hiking, and I can usually tell what's normal. That day, something about the atmosphere changed as I kept going deeper. It's hard to describe. The silence became heavier. I wasn't hearing the same bird calls I had when I first started. No rustling of small animals darting around, just a kind of thick quiet that made me feel like I was being watched. Then came the smell, a sour, pungent odor, like damp fur mixed with rotten vegetation. It didn't fit the clean forest air I'd been enjoying. I tried to ignore it, but it only got stronger as I walked. I thought maybe there was a dead animal nearby, something hidden under fallen branches. But I didn't see any carcass or anything like that. Still, that smell was sticking to my nose, making my stomach turn a bit. I stopped and listened. That's when I heard the faintest of sounds, like quiet footsteps on the forest floor, but deliberately slow, as if something was trying hard not to be heard. I know how squirrels and deer can be skittish, but this didn't sound like any small critter. These steps were heavier, more methodical. I looked around, peering between trees, trying to catch any movement. Nothing, just trunks, shadows, and patches of fading sunlight. I kept going, but now I was more on edge. Every few steps I'd pause, hold my breath, and listen. At times I was almost sure I could hear something circling me, staying just out of sight. I started to regret going off alone. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. My heart was thumping in my chest, and I tried to calm down, telling myself I was just spooked by the unfamiliar woods. After another few minutes, I stumbled into a small clearing. It wasn't big, just enough room to see a break in the canopy where the light fell a bit brighter on some mossy logs. That's where I saw it. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. There, standing near a fallen tree, was a tall, broad figure covered in dark, matted hair. It was on two legs, upright like a human, but way taller. Had to be at least 7 or 8 feet, maybe more. The shoulders were huge, and even from where I stood, I could see the build was something that didn't match anything I knew lived out there. Its head was slightly pointed, and the arms were long, hanging low. I just froze. I've seen bears stand on their hind legs before, but this wasn't a bear. The proportions were different, and it just didn't feel like that at all. For a moment, I didn't dare breathe. The creature turned its head toward me. I swear I felt my entire body break into a cold sweat. Its eyes were dark, but I could sense an intelligence behind them, something curious but calm. There was no immediate aggression, no growling or threatening posture. It just watched me, like it was sizing me up. I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. My heart was hammering, and my knees felt weak. I thought about backing away, but I was scared that any sudden movement might provoke it. So I just stood there, locked in a silent stare with something I couldn't even begin to classify. My mind was racing. Is this what people call a Bigfoot? A Sasquatch? Part of me wanted to laugh at how unreal it felt, but I couldn't. I was terrified, and yet I was strangely fascinated, like I had just stepped into a world I didn't believe in until that second. Eventually the creature tilted its head slightly, as if acknowledging my presence. Then it started to move. It turned, not hurriedly, and stepped away into the denser part of the forest. I watched the muscles under its coat flex with each stride. It made almost no sound. The only thing that lingered was that strange smell. And just like that, it faded into the shadows. 1 second it was there, the next it was swallowed by the dark green of the woods. I stood there for what felt like ages, but was probably only a minute or two, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. My heart was still pounding, and I had to force myself to move. The moment I took a step, my legs felt shaky. I decided I had to get back to my car. I didn't run, though every nerve in my body screamed to sprint. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see it following me, but I saw nothing, just trees and undergrowth. The forest seemed dead quiet again, except for my own footsteps and ragged breathing. When I finally reached my car, I jumped inside and locked the doors. My hands were trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I started the engine and pulled out of there as fast as I could, glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to catch a glimpse of something massive behind me. But there was nothing. I rolled into Whitefish later that afternoon, feeling numb and a bit nauseous. I thought about telling someone, maybe a park ranger or a local, but what was I going to say? That I saw a giant, hairy humanoid creature in the woods, and it just stared at me, then left? They'd think I was either lying or delirious. It was easier to say nothing, so I grabbed a quick bite, avoided eye contact with everyone, and decided to keep driving until I was far away. I just wanted to put miles between me and that place. The weirdest part is, it didn't attack me. It didn't even threaten me. It just watched me, like it was as curious about me as I was terrified of it. That's what still gets me when I think about it. You always hear people say these things, if they exist, would be dangerous, but this one wasn't. It felt like I'd intruded into its world, and it was letting me know that I was a visitor in its domain. To this day, I still can't fully explain what I saw. I've tried to rationalize it. Could it have been a person in a suit? That's ridiculous. Who would be out there so deep in the woods, silently creeping around in a costume? Could it have been some strange bear with mange or some weird growth? It just doesn't fit. The body shape, the face, the eyes, none of it matches any animal I know. I haven't really told many people. It sounds crazy, and I don't blame anyone who wouldn't believe it. But that doesn't change what I experienced. I know what I saw, and it still sends chills down my spine when I replay it in my mind. The memory is as vivid now as it was then. The silence, the smell, the feeling of being watched, and that brief moment when I locked eyes with something I was never taught could exist. Since then, every time I drive through remote areas, I think about that afternoon in Montana. I wonder how many others have stumbled upon something similar and kept quiet. I wonder what else might be out there, keeping a low profile, just living its life away from us. Part of me respects it, part of me fears it, and part of me is still trying to make sense of it, though I know I probably never will. In the end, that day just ended as strangely as it began. I left Whitefish behind, and the creature never followed me out. It was like some bizarre secret I accidentally discovered and then walked away from. Even now, I have no neat conclusion to offer. All I can say is that what I saw wasn't something I expected or wanted to believe in, but I can't deny my own experience. That memory will stay with me, a reminder that out there, beyond the roads and towns, the world might hold things we still don't understand. And maybe that's how it's meant to be. Story 11. Back in 2017, I took a few days off and headed out near Marble Mount, Washington. I had been feeling burned out from my job and decided I needed some real isolation. I've always been into hiking and camping, and I thought spending time deep in the North Cascades National Forest would clear my head. The place is stunning. Towering trees, quiet lakes, fresh air that you never get in the city. I set up a small camp in a pretty remote spot, far from marked trails, hoping no one would bother me. The first day was calm, just me settling in, collecting firewood, boiling some river water for coffee, that kind of thing. The second day, after a slow morning warming my hands around a tin cup of coffee, I decided to explore a faint trail I'd spotted not far from my tent. It wasn't really a marked path, just a suggestion of one, with crushed ferns and a narrow opening between thick underbrush. I figured it would be a good way to stretch my legs and maybe find a nicer view or a good spot to rest. I left my heavier gear at camp, just took a bottle of water, a snack, and a small folding knife clipped to my belt. The forest out there is dense, and the sunlight is weak, filtered through layers of leaves and branches. It gives everything this greenish, dim glow, and you lose your sense of time pretty easily. I walked for what felt like hours without seeing a single person. Not that I expected to. I mean, that was kind of the point, right? To be alone. But after a while I started feeling something I can only describe as unease. At first I just thought I was being paranoid. After all, I was completely by myself in a vast forest. It's normal to get that creeping feeling sometimes. But then it became stronger, like my body was picking up signals I couldn't explain. It's that prickly sensation on the back of your neck, that odd sense that you're not alone. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just me being jumpy. But the silence had changed. There was no bird song, no rustling of small animals. It was almost too quiet. I kept walking, a bit slower now, scanning the trees. All I could hear were my own footsteps and the soft crunch of needles under my boots. That's when I heard the snap of a branch off to my left. It wasn't one of those distant, random forest sounds. It was close, and it sounded deliberate. I froze. The hair on my arms stood up. I turned my head slowly and looked into the gaps between these massive trunks. The undergrowth there was thick, with ferns and moss covering everything. At first I saw nothing unusual. Then I spotted a shape. It moved so subtly that I almost missed it, but once I noticed, I couldn't look away. This figure stepped forward just enough for me to see it clearly. It stood on two legs, definitely not a bear. The body was covered in dark, matted hair, and I could see the outline of its shoulders, broad as hell, and its arms were long, hanging low. The thing's head was somewhat conical, not like a normal human head. I tried to see its face, but it was in partial shadow. I caught a hint of eyes, dark and deep, reflecting just a bit of the filtered light. It was tall. I'm not great at estimating heights, but it must have been over 7 feet. I'm about 6 feet, and this thing was clearly larger, not just taller, but heavier, more solid. My mind raced through every possibility. Was it a person in a suit? A bear with mange standing awkwardly? None of it made sense. The proportions were off. Bears don't stand that still on 2 legs, and a human that big and that covered in hair just doesn't make sense. The arms looked too long to be human. The torso too thick. Everything about it screamed, not supposed to be here. We just stared at each other for a long moment. My heart was pounding so hard I swear I could hear my pulse in my ears. I didn't know what to do. I was out there alone, no cell signal, nobody around for miles. I held my breath. The creature tilted its head slightly, like it was curious, sizing me up. It didn't growl, didn't bare teeth, didn't charge. It just watched me. There was something incredibly unsettling about its calmness. If it had attacked, at least I'd know what was happening and could run or fight. But this silent, intense staring was worse. It was as if I wasn't worth the effort, or it was just trying to figure out what I was doing there. I took one careful step back, and its head followed my movement. Another step back, and it leaned slightly forward, but it didn't come closer. I forced myself to breathe quietly, keeping my eyes on it. It was real. I know people will say I must have been tired or seeing things, but I can't stress enough how solid and real it looked. The forest around us felt heavier, the air thick with tension. I was scared in a way I've never been before, scared at a gut level. It felt like encountering something that shouldn't exist, like a glitch in reality. After what felt like forever, I took another step back, trying not to make any sudden moves. The creature then stepped back as well, almost mirroring me, but more gracefully. Without a sound, it moved behind a large tree trunk and blended into the darkness of the brush, disappearing as quietly as it had appeared. I stood there, heart pounding, unsure if I should turn around and run, or if that would trigger it to follow me. After a moment, I started moving backward along the way I had come, keeping my eyes on that spot. I didn't see it again. I didn't see any movement at all, and that might have been even more unnerving. It could have still been there, hidden, watching me, and I wouldn't know. I can't say how long it took me to get back to my campsite. My legs felt like rubber. The silence of the woods pressed in on me. Every snap of a twig made me jump. When I finally saw the orange flap of my tent in the distance, I almost cried from relief. I hurried over, trying to calm down, but my mind was racing. What the hell had I just seen? Could it really have been a Bigfoot? I always thought those stories were just tall tales, something fun to read about, but not real. Yet here I was, shaking, sweating, and absolutely convinced I saw something out there that isn't supposed to exist. I didn't stick around to find out more. I couldn't pack up immediately. It was too late, and I didn't have the guts to hike out in the dark. But I spent that evening huddled by my small fire, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every little noise sent a spike of fear through me. Eventually, the night passed without incident. I left as soon as there was enough light to navigate the forest safely. I made my way back toward Marble Mount, barely noticing the beauty around me, just wanting to be out of those woods. I didn't tell anyone in town. I mean, how would that sound? Hey, I saw a huge, hairy, man-like creature in the forest. They'd think I was nuts or messing with them. Plus, I wasn't eager to relive that moment so soon. In the months and years since, I've thought about it a lot. I know what I saw. I can't explain it, but I know it wasn't a bear, and it wasn't a person in a costume. There was something genuine and alive in those eyes, something that made me feel completely out of place, like I was trespassing in its world. To this day, I still get chills remembering that figure stepping out from behind the trees, watching me in complete silence. I've been camping since then, but never in that area, and never alone. There's a feeling you get when you know you've encountered something you can't categorize, something that doesn't fit neatly into what the world tells you is real. It shook me up more than I'd like to admit, and even now, when people laugh at Bigfoot sightings, I stay quiet. I know what I saw, and I know I'll never forget it. It showed up, studied me, and vanished back into the forest like a ghost. I have no idea why it appeared, and no idea why it let me leave. But it's out there, and that's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Story 12. I remember it was back in the summer of 2015. I had taken a few days off and driven up to Coudersport, Pennsylvania, just to clear my head. The plan was simple. Rent a small cabin, go on some light hikes, read by a creek, maybe watch the birds. Nothing special, nothing adventurous. I just wanted a break from my routine. I'd heard the area had peaceful trails, gentle hills, and a whole mix of quiet forests, perfect for someone just looking to unplug. On the second day, I decided to wander a bit deeper into the woods. I'd started the morning near a well-marked trail, but soon found a more obscure path branching off near a small, clear stream. It wasn't on the main map, but it looked just worn enough to be an old trail that had fallen out of use. I don't know what got into me. Maybe I was just feeling curious, or maybe the trickle of the creek was too inviting. Either way, I followed it. For a while, it was nice, really nice. I saw squirrels darting between the tree roots, a few birds flitting around in the branches. The morning sun was warm, but not too hot, and the air smelled like damp leaves and fresh earth. I could hear water running gently nearby. I remember thinking how perfect it all felt. Then I noticed the woods getting quieter. It's not unusual for the forest to calm down in certain stretches, but this felt different. The birdsong had faded almost completely. The breeze seemed to die down. Everything just got heavy and still. Even the air smelled different, heavier, muskier, not rotten, not exactly foul, just earthy, a mix of damp moss and something animal. I'd never smelled anything quite like it. It made me feel uneasy, like something was off. Still, I kept going, maybe a bit slower, my ears on high alert. I must have walked another couple 100 feet, stepping over some fallen branches, when I heard these heavy footsteps somewhere ahead and to my left. Not like a deer bounding away, this was slower, heavier, like a large person trying to move quietly, but not quite managing it. I froze. My heart was suddenly pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I listened, expecting any second to hear a voice saying, "Hello," or maybe see some hunter stepping through the brush, but there was just silence. I called out, "Hey, is anyone there?" My voice sounded small. No answer, of course. I waited, but all I got back was the faint rustle of leaves and my own breathing. I was about to turn back when my foot kicked something strange in the dirt. A footprint, or something like it. Big, much bigger than my own foot, and shaped kind of like a human's, but not quite right. The toes were spaced oddly, and the impression seemed deeper than a normal person would make. The ground was damp, which helped form a clear outline. I knelt down, touching the edges, and realized I didn't really want to know what made it. It was just wrong, or maybe not wrong, just off. As I stood back up, I felt a presence. I've never been one to say things like that lightly, but I swear I felt eyes on me. I looked up, and there it was, peering at me from behind a screen of branches and leaves. It was tall, easily taller than a large man, covered in dark, matted hair. Its shoulders looked massive, its arms long. But it wasn't just some bulky ape. The face had contours that seemed almost human, and the eyes, even in the dim light, caught the sun in a way that made them shine. They had a certain intelligence, like it was thinking, not just reacting on instinct. I just stood there, rooted in place, not sure if I should run or speak or do nothing. My body felt cold, and my mouth went dry. I remember my ears ringing a little like after a loud noise, but the woods were silent. The creature didn't move, didn't snarl, didn't charge at me. It just watched. I swear I could see its chest rise and fall, slow and steady, like it was waiting for me to do something first. I thought about turning my back and bolting, but something in me said that was a bad idea. So I took a step back, just one step, trying not to make any sudden move. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if curious. That's when I realized it wasn't just a dumb animal. It recognized that I was afraid, or at least uncomfortable. Maybe it was deciding what to do next. I took another step back, slower this time, my eyes never leaving its face. It blinked once, at least I think it blinked, and just stayed where it was. I kept backing away, careful not to trip over anything. The forest was still dead quiet, and the weird smell lingered in the air. After maybe 4 or 5 steps, some branches and leaves started blocking my line of sight, and I lost sight of the creature behind the thick brush. I almost expected it to come crashing through after me, but nothing happened, just silence. I didn't run at first. I was too shaken. Instead, I walked fast, eyes darting around, listening for any sign that it was following me. But the footsteps I'd heard before didn't start up again. No heavy breathing behind me, no snapping twigs. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched until I finally hit a more familiar part of the trail. That's when I let myself move faster. I practically jogged the rest of the way back, looking over my shoulder more times than I care to admit. When I finally reached the road, the world felt normal again. Birds were singing, a car passed by in the distance, and the sky looked brighter somehow. It felt like I'd stepped out of some strange bubble of silence and back into reality. But I knew what I'd seen. I didn't imagine it. I never told anyone in Kudasport about it. I didn't want to be the outsider making up weird stories about monsters in the woods. I kept expecting to see something in the local newspaper, maybe a report of strange sightings or odd footprints found on a trail. Nothing. Just normal small-town life going on as usual. On my last day in the cabin, I thought about driving back to that spot, trying to find the footprints again, or any evidence that could prove I wasn't hallucinating. But the thought of going back there alone made me feel sick to my stomach. Instead, I packed up and headed home, quiet and uneasy. Since then, I've run through the memory so many times in my head, always arriving at the same dead end. I can't explain it. It didn't fit into any category of animal I know. It looked like something that shouldn't exist, at least not out there in a small Pennsylvania forest. Even now, I have this lingering feeling that the world is bigger and stranger than we like to believe. I try not to think too hard about it because it still freaks me out. Whatever I saw knew I was there. It saw me first, probably. It decided not to attack or chase me. It just watched, as if it was just as curious about me as I was terrified of it. After that day, nothing similar ever happened. I've been hiking in other places since then and never felt that kind of dread or seen anything remotely like that creature. Maybe it was a one-time thing. Maybe I stumbled into its territory, and after I left, it went back to hiding, blending into the silence of that patch of forest. To this day, I can't fully process it, but I know what I saw. It wasn't a dream, and it wasn't a bear. I can't explain it better than that. It happened, it ended, and that's it. I still think about those eyes sometimes, and how the air felt so heavy and strange. I guess I'll never know what the hell it was. It's just something I have to live with, a silent memory from that quiet afternoon in Kudasport. Story 13. I remember that day in the summer of 2021 like it was yesterday. I'd driven up to Helena, Montana a few days earlier, planning to camp out in the more remote areas beyond the city. I wanted to clear my head, get away from the usual routine, and just feel that quiet calm of being surrounded by nature. The first couple of days went exactly as I'd hoped. I set up a simple camp, not too far from a small creek with crystal-clear water. The sky was always bright and blue, and I could hear birds singing the whole time. I'd read, scribble a few thoughts in my notebook, and sometimes just lie back and do nothing. It was perfect. I'm not totally sure what pushed me to head deeper north that particular day. Maybe I just wanted to see more of the landscape. Maybe I was feeling restless. I packed a small day pack with water, an energy bar, a compass, and my pocket knife. Just the basics. I figured I'd walk a couple of hours in, then come back before it got too late. As I started along this narrow trail that wound through tall pines, I immediately noticed something felt off. It wasn't anything drastic at first, just a subtle shift. The breeze that had been gently shaking the tree branches seemed to vanish, and all the birds I'd been hearing non-stop just stopped. No singing, no rustling, just silence, aside from my own footsteps and breathing. I'm not one to freak out easily, but the sudden quiet made my heart pick up speed. It felt like stepping into some weird bubble, where everything beyond a certain point just didn't exist. Still, I kept going. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was getting spooked by nothing. I tried to focus on the texture of the forest floor under my boots, or the smell of the pine needles, but that uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. After maybe another half hour, I turned a corner in the trail and stumbled onto something that nearly made me stop breathing altogether. There was this odd structure right off the path, made of branches stacked in a kind of pattern, not like a lean-to or something that a person would typically build. It reminded me of those stories you hear, people finding weird teepee-like shapes deep in the woods, branches placed just so, almost like a signal or a marker. The branches were thick, some as long as my arm, broken off clean and arranged in a way that didn't feel random. Everything about it screamed, someone or something did this intentionally. I didn't dare touch it. I just stared, trying to figure it out. It didn't look like a shelter. It looked more like a warning or some kind of boundary line. I don't know how long I stood there, a minute, maybe two. Eventually, I forced myself to move on, but now I felt like I was being watched, like eyes were on me from behind every trunk. The silence was absolute, and that's what made it worse. No sound except my boots on the needle-covered ground and my own pulse thumping in my ears. I kept going, though. I guess I was trying to prove something to myself. I didn't want to head straight back to camp, not yet. But after another few minutes, that's when I saw it. Between two thick trees about 50 feet ahead, I caught a glimpse of a figure that made every hair on my body stand up. It was tall, taller than any human I've met, covered in dark, matted hair from head to toe. It stood upright on two legs, not hunched like a bear might. Its body seemed broad and powerful. And then I saw its face. Not clearly enough to describe every detail, but enough to know that it wasn't just some animal. There was an awareness there, an intelligence. The eyes were dark and seemed to lock onto mine the instant I noticed it. My first reaction was a jolt of terror. I remember my hands going cold, my mouth going dry. I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at this thing while it stared right back. My brain scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was a person in a ghillie suit. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. But nothing made sense. It was too real, too solid, and its posture wasn't human. It didn't flinch, didn't make a sound. It just watched me. I thought about running, but the fear that it might chase me was overwhelming. So I did the only thing that made sense. I slowly stepped backward, 1 foot at a time, trying to show that I wasn't a threat. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. If this thing wanted to come after me, I knew I wouldn't have a chance. I'm not fast, I'm not strong, and I was alone out here. Completely alone. But it didn't chase me. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, like it was studying me, or maybe even curious. That almost unsettled me more than if it had roared or charged. The quiet curiosity in its movement felt even more unsettling. I tried to keep breathing slowly and not make sudden moves. After a few painfully long seconds, I turned my body a little more and started walking back the way I came, never fully turning my back, just inching away. For a few minutes, I expected to hear heavy footsteps behind me, the rustle of branches, or something that would tell me it was following, but there was nothing. Absolute silence. When I finally got enough courage to look back over my shoulder, I saw only the trees. The thing was gone. I don't know if it moved silently or if it just stepped behind some thick brush, but it vanished so completely I wondered for a second if I'd imagined it. but I knew I hadn't. It was way too vivid and too terrifying to be some daydream. I practically speed-walked back toward my camp. I didn't want to run and break my ankle or something, but I couldn't get out of there fast enough. The whole hike back, I didn't see a single animal, not even a squirrel. The forest was like a place that had been drained of normal life. Nothing but the sound of my footsteps and my breathing, getting heavier from fear rather than exertion. By the time I reached my campsite, I felt completely different about the place. What had been a cozy little spot next to a clear stream now felt exposed and dangerous. My tent looked flimsy and worthless as any kind of protection. I wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but the sun was still up, and I was too rattled to think straight. I ended up sitting on a log, just holding my head in my hands, trying to process what I'd seen. My mind kept replaying the moment I locked eyes with that creature. I'd never seen eyes like that on an animal. There was depth there, something unsettlingly human-like, but also not human at all. I considered grabbing my phone and snapping a picture if I went back, but I knew there was no way I was going back there. Even if I tried to explain it, who would believe me? People would say I saw a bear, or that I made it up, or that I was hallucinating, but I know what I saw, and it didn't fit into any category I can think of. Before dusk, I decided to pack up. I left earlier than I'd planned. I walked back toward the dirt road that had led me into this area, moving fast, glancing back every so often. Every sound I made, every twig that snapped under my boots, sounded like a gunshot in the quiet woods. But no giant figure emerged, no strange structures popped up along the way. The silence eventually broke as I got closer to more familiar ground. I heard birds again, saw a couple of deer in the distance. It felt like I'd crossed back into the normal world, leaving some hidden pocket of the forest behind me. I made it back to my car just as the sun was dipping low, the sky turning orange and pink. I threw my gear in the trunk, sat behind the wheel, and just stared at the steering wheel for a few minutes, trying to calm myself down. My heart was still racing, and my hands were shaking. I didn't bother with dinner. I just drove back to Helena, hardly looking in the rearview mirror. Part of me kept expecting to see something trailing behind, but I never did. I've tried to make sense of it since then. It's been a while, and I still can't explain it. I don't really tell people because I know what reactions I'd get. But I'm writing this down here because I need to get it off my chest somehow. I know there are stories and rumors out there about strange creatures in the Montana wilderness, and I guess I'm one more person who stumbled into something I can't understand. I still think about that moment when our eyes met. That's the part that won't leave me. The way it just stood there, watching, not running, not attacking, just observing me. It was like for a brief moment we both knew we weren't supposed to be in that exact spot at the same time. And when I backed away, it let me go. No noise, no chase, no explanation. And then it was gone, as suddenly as I'd appeared in its world. I can't wrap my head around it. All I know is that I've never felt that kind of fear before or since. I haven't been back to that area, and I don't plan to. If that creature is still out there, whatever it is, maybe it's best left alone. I guess some things in this world just aren't meant to be understood. Story 14. I remember it was late spring 2016 when I decided to head out near Silverton, Oregon. I'd been dealing with a ton of stress back in the city, and I just wanted to clear my head. My plan was simple: hike into a less crowded part of the state forest, set up a small camp, and spend a couple of days disconnected from all the noise. I packed light, just a tent, some basic supplies, and a paper map and compass, hoping I could keep my phone turned off most of the time. I'd heard the area had some old trails that weren't well marked, and that's what I wanted. I wanted to feel like I was somewhere untouched, or at least less touched by people. On the second morning I started early, right after I boiled some water for coffee. The woods around Silverton can feel damp and heavy in the morning. Everything was dripping from a light overnight rain. The moss on the tree trunks looked bright green and thick, and there was a silence that almost pressed in on me. At first it felt peaceful, like I had the whole place to myself. But as I moved farther along a faint trail, it started to feel strange. I can't say exactly why. Maybe it was how quiet everything got. Usually I'd hear birds or the rustle of small animals, but at some point that morning, all that seemed to fade. I just heard my own footsteps pushing into the soft ground, and now and then the hiss of a gentle breeze through the branches. Then I saw them. Footprints. Huge ones. They weren't obvious at first. It was more like I stepped in a patch of mud and then realized the indentation next to mine didn't match anything I'd ever seen. They looked like giant human footprints, only broader, deeper, and way larger than any normal person's foot. Each print must have been at least twice the length of mine. I'm a pretty average-sized guy, and this thing must have been massive. I crouched down and touched the edge of one print, feeling the wet earth. It seemed fresh. No leaves had settled into it. No water had pooled. Something big had come this way not long before I arrived. My heart started pounding. I don't know if it was fear, excitement, or just the shock of seeing something so strange. I've spent time in the woods before. I know there are bears and cougars, but this wasn't a paw print. It looked like a bare human foot, just way too big. I thought about turning back, but the curious part of me wanted to see what made those tracks, or at least follow them a bit. The tracks led deeper into the forest, away from the overgrown trail I was on. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I moved carefully, trying not to make noise. About 10 minutes later, I came to a small clearing where a few trees had fallen, creating a sort of open patch with low shrubs and ferns. The air smelled like wet earth and rotting wood. And then I saw it. At first, just a shape, dark and tall, partially obscured by a fallen trunk and some brush. It stood upright, facing away from me. Covered in dark, matted hair, its shoulders were broad and the arms hung low. It wasn't a bear. Bears have a different shape and posture. This was more like some huge, hairy person, but at the same time, not quite human. The head was conical, the neck thick. I just froze. I could feel the blood draining from my face. I stayed absolutely still, not even daring to breathe loudly. I must have stood there, half hidden behind a cluster of ferns, for maybe 30 seconds. It didn't notice me at first. It seemed to be sniffing the air, or maybe looking at something on the ground. It had this presence. I know that sounds weird, but I mean it was like I could feel it in my gut. A huge, living thing that shouldn't be there, that I didn't have a category for. My heart was hammering so hard I worried it would hear me. I took a tiny step back, trying to retreat. That's when a branch under my foot snapped. A sharp crack that echoed through that unnatural silence. The creature turned its head slowly, and I caught a glimpse of its face. It had deep-set eyes, a flat nose, and a kind of heavy brow ridge. Its eyes were dark, and I swear it looked right into mine. In that moment, I thought I was done for. Every warning I've ever heard about wild animals flashed in my mind. Don't run, don't scream, don't act aggressive. But this wasn't a bear, or a moose, or something I could rationalize away. It was something else, something I'd never encountered, and I had no idea what it would do. My stomach knotted, and I raised my hands slightly, palms out, like I was showing it I wasn't a threat. I didn't have a weapon anyway, just a small pocket knife in my pack, completely useless now. It didn't charge me, it didn't roar, it just stood there watching me. I could see the rise and fall of its massive chest. I could hear my breathing, shallow and forced. My mind raced. Do I back away slowly? Do I speak? I decided to just remain calm and still. After a few seconds that felt like an eternity, it turned its head back away from me, as if I wasn't worth the trouble. Then it started moving off to the side, stepping easily over a fallen log that would take me real effort to climb over. It disappeared into thicker brush, and I could hear branches snapping softly as it moved. It wasn't in a hurry. It was like it had seen something annoying in its path and just decided to walk around it. After it was gone, I just stood there, feeling the forest come back to life very slowly. A bird called in the distance. A drip of water fell from a leaf onto my jacket sleeve. My knees were shaking. I tried to process what had just happened. I'd seen something that shouldn't exist, or at least isn't officially recognized. A tall, hairy creature walking on two legs, massive footprints, a face that looked both ape-like and human. I'd always thought Bigfoot stories were just that, stories. But now I was standing in the middle of the woods, feeling the fear and confusion that comes from knowing you saw something that doesn't fit into the world you know. I didn't wait around. I made my way back to my camp, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every crack of a twig made me jump. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands still trembling. I hadn't planned on leaving that day, but there was no way I was staying another night out here alone. I felt like I was trespassing in some place where humans weren't really welcome. Before I left the area, I took a moment to catch my breath and try to think it through. I felt stupid, honestly. Who was going to believe me if I told them what I saw? Yet I knew what I saw. I can still picture it now, the way it moved, the size of those footprints. I know something was out there, something alive and aware. And I know it saw me too. I hiked back toward a more familiar trail, taking longer than expected because I was so rattled and kept getting turned around. Eventually, I made it out near a service road and got back to my car. The drive back to Silverton felt surreal, like I was stuck in my own head replaying that encounter, trying to find another explanation. But every time I tried, I came back to the same conclusion. I had seen something people claim doesn't exist. Even now, I think about that day. I didn't go out there expecting anything like this. I wanted some peace and quiet, maybe to recharge my batteries. Instead, I got a glimpse of something I can't fully explain. I never reported it to any officials. I mean, what would I say? I didn't tell friends for a long time either. The few times I've mentioned it, I just get that look, like they're humoring me or they think I'm making it up. But I'm not. It happened, and what's even stranger is how it all ended so abruptly. One moment, I'm face to face with something that shouldn't exist, and the next, it's gone, leaving me with nothing but muddy footprints and a memory I can't shake. There was no big event afterward, no grand finale, no sudden understanding. It just ended as quickly as it started. That's the part that still gets under my skin. Something that massive, that unknown, can just appear in your life and then vanish again, leaving you unsure if it really happened at all. But I know it did. I felt its presence, and I saw it with my own eyes. And I guess I'll carry that knowledge, whether anyone believes me or not. I still don't have an explanation, and maybe I never will. Story 15. I remember it was late afternoon on my third day out there, somewhere near Packwood, Washington, close to Mount Rainier. I had been hiking and camping alone since I arrived, not because I'm some extreme survivalist, but simply because I wanted a break from everything. The first couple of days had been almost too calm. Just me, my small tent near a quiet stream, some basic food, and the smell of damp earth and pine needles. It was peaceful, and that's exactly what I'd been looking for. That changed suddenly on that third day. I'd decided to explore an area off the main trail, a place I hadn't ventured into before. It was slightly uphill, and the forest grew denser as I moved forward. The sound of the wind brushing through tall pines and the distant gurgle of some creek had become familiar. But at some point, I noticed a silence that didn't feel natural. It wasn't just quiet, It was like everything that normally fills the woods with life had decided to hold its breath. No birds, no squirrels rustling leaves, no insects chirping. It felt like stepping into a bubble of absolute stillness. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself nature can be unpredictable, but my gut told me something was off. As I kept walking, I came across these strange impressions on the ground. They weren't distinct tracks like you'd see in damp soil, but more like flattened areas of moss and leaves that hinted something heavy had passed through. The stride was long and spaced in a weird pattern. I couldn't immediately say what might have caused them, but it gave me the creeps. It was as if something large and cautious had moved through, making as little noise as possible, but still leaving a subtle trace behind. I slowed down, gripping my walking stick more tightly. My eyes started scanning the trees, half expecting to see a bear. But that's when I spotted movement between a cluster of thick trunks, about 20 or 30 yards ahead. I struggled to focus for a second, thinking maybe I was just freaking myself out. But as I squinted through the shifting light and shadows, I saw it clearly. A tall figure covered in dark, matted hair, standing upright like a person. It was massive, way too tall and broad-shouldered to be a normal human. The proportions were strange. Its arms seemed too long, its body thick and powerful. It wasn't making any sound, and it seemed to be partially hiding, with only part of its form visible behind the rough bark of a large tree. My heart almost stopped. I remember feeling this electric surge of panic shoot through me. Not the kind of fear you get when you bump into a bear or another wild animal you can identify. This was something else because I had no idea what I was looking at. It looked back at me with what I can only describe as a calculated stillness, like it knew I'd seen it and was waiting to see what I'd do next. I didn't know if I should run, shout, or drop to the ground and pretend to be invisible. I ended up just standing there, gripping my stick so hard my knuckles turned white. The creature didn't charge. It just remained there, watching. I felt like prey being measured up. It tilted its head slightly, and in that moment, my entire body was screaming at me to leave, to back away as quietly as possible. I did just that, took slow, careful steps backward, never turning my back on it, not wanting to show panic. My boots crushed some twigs, and every tiny sound I made seemed deafening. The figure didn't follow. It just kept staring. Eventually it shifted its weight and seemed to step back further into the darkness of the trees. Within a few seconds, it was gone. But I could still sense its presence, as if it hadn't really left, just found a darker spot to watch from. I kept moving backward until I couldn't see that area anymore. Then I turned and made my way as fast as I could to my camp. I almost tripped several times on roots and loose rocks. By the time I reached my tent, I was drenched in sweat. Everything around looked normal, as if I'd just imagined the whole thing. But I knew what I'd seen, and my nerves were on edge. I debated packing up right then and there and getting the hell out. The afternoon light was dimming, and I still had several hours of daylight if I pushed myself. But my legs felt weak, and my mind was spinning. Instead, I decided to quietly pack what I could, just in case I needed to leave in a hurry. I tried to calm down, telling myself maybe it was some large animal, or I'd seen a trick of the light. Yet, deep inside, I knew this was something else. As I started to break down my small camp, I heard a muffled crack somewhere behind me, far enough away to not see anything, but close enough to tell me that something big was still moving out there. I forced myself to keep my breathing quiet and slow. I had the unsettling feeling of being watched again, like two eyes boring into my back. Every time I stopped to listen, the forest gave me nothing. No clear sign of footsteps, just an occasional subtle shift in the undergrowth. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that massive shape looming behind me. My biggest fear was that it might creep closer once darkness fell. Sunset was approaching, and I knew everything would be worse in the dark. I tried to be as silent as possible, packing up. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped my flashlight. I had this sense that if I made too much noise, if I fumbled around too much, it would see me as easy prey. The silence pressed down on me until my ears rang. Once I was ready to move, I started back along the route I'd originally come in on, trying not to look like I was fleeing, but I was definitely moving faster than normal. I couldn't stop imagining that towering figure stepping through the trees, following my scent. I kept seeing its form in my mind, that heavy, dark fur, and the strange way it tilted its head, as if studying me. Every slight sound in the forest made me jump, a branch snapping in the distance, a sudden rustle of leaves, even my own pack straps squeaking. I'm not ashamed to say I was terrified. I've encountered bears, cougars, and even cranky moose in my life, but I've never felt such a primal sense of being completely outmatched and clueless about what I was dealing with. As twilight came, I finally reached a more familiar part of the trail system. The tension in my muscles eased a bit, but only slightly. I didn't see any more strange footprints, and I didn't catch another glimpse of that thing. Eventually, the forest around me started to sound like a forest again. Distant birds chirping, maybe a rodent scurrying through the brush. That oppressive silence was gone, as if whatever I'd seen had decided to slip back into a world I wasn't meant to witness. By the time I got back to my car, it was getting dark. I tossed my gear inside and sat behind the wheel, just sitting there for a moment, trying to process what had happened. My hands were still trembling. I ended up leaving sooner than I'd planned and spent the night in a cheap motel. I can't fully explain what I saw. There's no neat conclusion. It's not like I ran into anyone else who claimed to have seen it, and I sure as hell didn't report it to any officials. Who would believe me? To this day, I can't pin a name or a label on it, but I know what I experienced was real. I wasn't half asleep, I wasn't dreaming, and I sure wasn't looking for some supernatural encounter. I was just a guy wanting some quiet time in the woods. Instead, I ran straight into something that I can't logically explain. It haunts me even now, thinking about how quickly everything changed, how normal the day began, and how unsettling it ended. Sometimes I remember that silence, that heavy quiet that fell over the forest right before I saw it. I think about how it watched me, how it seemed more curious than frightened. That's what sticks with me. The intelligence I felt behind those eyes, the sense that it was weighing options in its head. And then, just like that, it was gone, leaving me with a story I still struggle to tell without feeling the panic and confusion all over again. Story 16. I remember it was a chilly afternoon in late October 2020, right near the end of my stay in a small cabin outside Ely, Minnesota. I had decided to spend a week there, just to clear my head after that insane year. I had chosen a spot surrounded by endless forests and scattered lakes. It felt like the perfect place to step away from the constant noise I'd been dealing with back home. Just me, a rented cabin, and some light hiking along quiet trails. The first few days had been uneventful, but in a good way. I'd wake up early, brew some coffee, then head out for a walk. I stuck to the main paths, enjoying the earthy smell of wet leaves and pine needles, the distant hum of water flowing somewhere behind the trees, and the occasional glimpse of a deer or a curious fox darting away at my approach. It was the kind of peace I'd been craving, where even the smallest crunch of gravel under my boots seemed amplified in the silence of the woods. On that particular afternoon, I remember the sky was gray, not stormy but dim enough to turn the forest slightly darker than usual. I decided to take a different route, something not clearly marked. I wasn't planning on going too far, but I wanted to explore a bit more off the beaten path, just to find a new angle of the landscape to photograph or maybe stumble upon a stream I hadn't seen yet. The air was cool, and every breath felt crisp in my lungs. As I moved away from the areas I knew, I noticed how the atmosphere shifted. The usual background noises, birds chirping, squirrels rustling in the underbrush, the wind pushing through branches, started to fade. It wasn't that I lost my hearing or anything dramatic like that. It was more like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to brush it off as me just overthinking. After all, I was in unfamiliar territory. Maybe the wildlife here was just quieter, or maybe they were sensing me as an intruder. I kept going, stepping carefully over fallen logs and soft patches of moss. The forest floor was thick with damp leaves, muffling my footsteps. I remember my boots sinking slightly into the earth with each step, the cold dampness creeping in. At some point, I got the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't a paranoid thought. It was more of a sudden awareness that I wasn't alone. I stopped, not sure why, and just listened. There was a slight rustle, a branch cracking softly, and I turned my head. It took me a second to focus my eyes in that dim light, but then I saw something. At first, I honestly thought it might be a person, tall and upright, but then my brain started registering the details. This figure was massive, easily taller than any human I've encountered. It was covered in what looked like brownish, matted hair or fur, not like a bear's thick coat, more uneven, hanging off its body. And it stood there, completely still, watching me. I froze. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel my pulse in my neck. The creature didn't charge or roar. It didn't grunt or make any clear sound at all. It just stared, and that was somehow more unsettling than if it had made some aggressive move. The tension in that moment was unlike anything I've felt before. It felt like we were both sizing each other up, two beings that had no business confronting each other like this. There was a sense that it understood I was out of place, that I was intruding. I remember trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a person in a heavy coat, or maybe a large animal standing upright for a moment. But nothing fit. The proportions were all wrong. Its arms seemed too long, its shoulders too broad. And those eyes, I couldn't see them perfectly, but I could sense them locked onto me, taking in my size, my posture, everything. The silence surrounding us was heavy and unnatural. I knew I needed to get out of there. My chest felt tight, like my body was screaming to turn around and leave. I took a slow step backward, careful not to make any sudden moves. The creature didn't move toward me, but its head turned slightly, following my step. I took another step back, keeping my eyes on it. My legs felt shaky, and I was afraid if I looked away, it would rush at me. But it didn't. It just continued to observe, completely calm, as if it knew it had the upper hand in whatever weird standoff we were having. I must have backed away a good 20 or 30 feet, stepping over roots and fallen branches, never breaking eye contact. Eventually, the creature's shape started to blend back into the surrounding trees, as if it were part of the forest itself. There wasn't a sudden disappearance or a dramatic escape. It was just gradually hidden by the trunks and branches. Before I even realized it, I couldn't see it anymore. It was gone, or at least out of my line of sight. My adrenaline was pumping so hard I felt nauseous. I didn't want to turn my back on the spot, but I knew I had to leave. I moved faster, still looking over my shoulder, straining my ears for any sound of pursuit. There was nothing, just silence. And then after a few minutes, the normal forest sounds began to return, as if nature had decided I was no longer worth worrying about. When I finally reached a familiar trail, I felt a rush of relief. I remember almost laughing at how absurd it all felt, but I couldn't. My hands were shaking. I knew what I saw was real. I wasn't tired, I wasn't daydreaming, and I've seen plenty of bears before. This wasn't a bear. I don't know what it was, and even as I think back, the memory still feels raw. Back at the cabin, I locked the door and sat down for a long time, just trying to piece it together. Should I tell someone? Would they believe me? Ely's a small place, and I figured anyone I told would assume I'd mistaken a bear or that I was spooked by a shadow. But I know what I saw. And what I remember most clearly is that feeling of intelligence, the way it watched me, not with a mindless predator's hunger, but with a measured curiosity, almost like it was deciding whether I was a threat or just another clueless human wandering too far. I never saw it again during the last couple of days I spent there. I avoided that part of the woods entirely and stuck close to well-worn paths near the cabin. Everything seemed normal. The birds were back to their usual chatter, and small animals moved about without fear. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I might have convinced myself it never happened. But I can't shake the memory. The image of that tall, fur-covered figure standing there, silent and impossible, is burned into my mind. To this day, I still don't know what to make of it. I've read a few odd stories online, people claiming they saw strange creatures in the woods, but I never fully believed them until I had my own experience. It's not something I can easily laugh off. I'm not saying I discovered some mystical beast or anything like that. Maybe there are animals out there that we just haven't officially recognized. Or maybe these things are around more often than we know, always one step away from being caught in plain sight. All I can say for sure is that I encountered something that afternoon in the forest near Ely. I stood face to face with something that shouldn't exist. It didn't attack me, didn't communicate, didn't do much of anything but stand there, staring. Yet that was enough to rattle me in a way no ordinary animal ever could. As I left Ely at the end of that week, driving back through those quiet roads, I looked at the dense tree lines with a new sense of respect and a hint of fear. There are places deep in those woods that don't care about our explanations or our comfort. They simply are, and whatever they hold remains theirs. In my case, I got a glimpse of something I can't understand, and that glimpse is something I've carried with me ever since. It began and ended that same day, leaving me with no answers, just the uneasy certainty that I saw something real. And I've never been able to explain it. Story 17. In the fall of 2022, I decided to spend a few days around Luray, Virginia, near Shenandoah National Park. I'd rented a small cabin with the idea of doing some moderate hikes, taking in those incredible mountain views, and just clearing my head after months of stressful work. The first few days went by pretty normally. I stuck to well-known trails, the kind that show up on the standard park maps. It was autumn, so the leaves were turning these brilliant shades of orange, red, and yellow, and the air had that damp, earthy smell. I took plenty of photos, scribbled down some notes in my journal, and generally felt like I was finally unwinding. On the fourth morning, I decided to try something different. Instead of heading toward the popular lookout points, I followed a narrower, less obvious trail I'd noticed the day before. It split off from a main path, but wasn't marked on any of my maps. It looked like something used occasionally by locals or more adventurous hikers. The trail was covered with wet leaves, making the ground a bit slippery. I had to be careful with my footing. At first, I still heard the usual forest sounds, birds calling, maybe a small animal rustling through the underbrush. But as I got deeper in, the air got oddly still. I can't say exactly when I noticed that silence, but it hit me like a sudden chill. The birds stopped. I mean, completely. Not a single chirp. No squirrels darting between trees, no distant crack of a branch. It was so quiet that I could hear my own breathing, heavier than normal, because I was a bit spooked. The quiet put me on edge. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, maybe just a weird patch of woods, but it felt wrong. Something about the place felt off, like I'd stepped into a part of the forest that didn't want me there. After maybe an hour on this unmarked route, the vegetation got denser. I had to push aside thick bushes and duck under low branches. The leaves were damp, some half rotten, leaving this musty smell on my hands. That's when I spotted something moving ahead of me. I couldn't see it clearly at first. It was just a flicker of motion between the trees. My heart kicked into high gear, and I froze, thinking maybe it was a deer or even a black bear. But as I leaned forward, trying to get a better look, I realized the shape was all wrong. It was tall, really tall. The figure was standing upright, not on four legs. At first glance, I thought maybe it was a person in a ghillie suit or some heavy coat, but the outline didn't match any normal hiker's silhouette. I saw what looked like broad shoulders, no visible neck, and thick, dark hair that covered a huge part of its body. I'm not talking about a guy with a beard or a hairy jacket. This thing looked covered in hair from head to toe. I tried to swallow, but my throat had gone dry. I didn't move. I didn't even want to blink. My instinct was to step back, to create space, but something told me not to run. I think I was just too scared, too stunned. The figure shifted slightly, as if turning its head toward me. I swear I saw eyes reflecting faintly, catching a bit of the filtered morning light. There was no snorting, no growling, no typical animal sound. It just stood there, breathing quietly. I could actually hear its breathing, slow and measured. That's what really freaked me out. It sounded calm, like it was studying me. I raised my hands slowly, palms facing forward, like I was showing it. I meant no harm. I didn't even know why I did that. It just felt like what you do when you don't want to startle something. The creature's head tilted to one side, almost curiously. My stomach was in knots, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. I remember thinking that if this thing charged me, I had nowhere to go. The brush was too thick to sprint through. I was trapped in that tunnel of branches and leaves. We stood there for what felt like forever, but it was probably just a handful of seconds. My legs were shaking. There was a smell in the air, something earthy and slightly sour, like wet fur and old vegetation. It wasn't overpowering, but it was noticeable, something I'd never smelled on any trail before. Without warning, the creature took a few steps backward. It didn't turn its back to me right away. It sort of moved sideways at first, keeping me in its line of sight. Then it slipped behind a cluster of trees. I heard a rustle of leaves and some heavy footsteps fading away. Then silence again. I stood there, knees weak, not sure if I should follow or run back. My gut told me to leave, to get the hell out of that area. I didn't want to chase after it and find out what else it could do. Instead, I started backing up, slowly at first, then faster, as I realized it was gone. Within a few minutes, I was practically stumbling through the woods, half lost, looking for the main trail. My mind was racing. What did I just see? The word Bigfoot popped into my head, but that felt ridiculous. Still, I couldn't ignore how massive it was, how human-like, yet not human at all. Nothing else fit. I eventually made it back to more familiar territory. I recognized some fallen logs and a particular rock formation I'd passed earlier. Once I was back on a known trail, I picked up the pace. I didn't see anyone else that day. No other hikers, no rangers. I think I was too early in the season, or maybe off in a less frequented part of the park. When I reached my cabin, I locked the door and sat on the small porch for a while, shaking. The craziest part is I never heard it scream, never saw it go into a rage or anything. It just stood there and watched me, like it was as curious or confused as I was. That calmness was almost worse than aggression, because it showed something controlled, something with its own sense of caution. I keep replaying that moment where our eyes met. It wasn't blank or brainless. It looked right at me, and it was as if it understood I didn't belong there. I've tried to rationalize it. Could it have been a hoax? A guy in a suit? But who would bother doing that out there, at that hour, and so deep off the main trails? And this thing was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with proportions that didn't look fake. The hair wasn't some cheap costume fur. It looked natural, varying shades of brown, matted in places, lighter in others. The muscles underneath were clearly defined in a way a bulky suit wouldn't replicate. Even now I can't fully explain it. I keep thinking maybe I stumbled into its territory, some feeding spot or nesting area, and it just wanted me gone. I didn't tell the rangers or anyone in town. Who would believe me? People would say I was overworked or hallucinating. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. The silence in that section of forest was unnatural, like the whole place was holding its breath. After that day, I cut my trip short by a couple of days. I just couldn't relax anymore. Every time I went outside, I was looking over my shoulder, imagining I might see it again. I slept poorly and woke up sweating, my mind replaying that encounter on a loop. Before leaving, I did stand on the porch one last time and stare at the tree line. I remember thinking how normal it all looked, just trees and leaves, the kind of scenery I'd appreciated my whole life. But now it felt like the trees were hiding something, concealing a presence that didn't belong in my version of reality. I drove back home with more questions than answers. Since then, I've read a few accounts online from people who claim they've seen something similar in the Appalachian region. I didn't used to believe in this stuff, I was always the skeptical one. But after what happened, I can't just dismiss their stories. Something's out there, and it's not some campfire tale. It's real, it's quiet, and it's watching. I still don't know what to call it. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, unknown primate. None of the labels feel right. But I know what I saw was no bear, and no ordinary human. A year later, I still get goosebumps when I think about the way it looked at me, how it left without a sound, and how the forest slipped back into its normal rhythm as soon as it vanished. I wish I had some neat conclusion, some proof or final revelation, but I don't. It happened, it ended, and I can't explain it. The memory lingers in my mind, a reminder that there are things out there we haven't figured out. All I can say is that I walked into those woods expecting another quiet hike and left with a story I never thought I'd tell. Story 18. In 2019, I took a trip to Eureka Springs, Arkansas, mostly because I wanted a quiet place to camp and hike a bit on my own. I'm not a hardcore survivalist or anything, but I'd done my share of weekends in the woods, so I felt comfortable enough going slightly off the beaten path. The town is known for its charm, the springs, and some touristy spots. But what I really wanted were the dense forests around the area, the ones that people don't talk about as much. I remember the first day being perfectly normal. I set up my small tent in a relatively flat area, surrounded by a mix of oaks and hickories, and the ground was covered by a thick layer of leaves that muffled every step. The sunlight filtered through in a soft way, making everything feel calm. I spent that day just poking around, taking a few photos, getting the lay of the land. There was a comfortable stillness. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. Nothing unusual at all. But on the second day, I decided to follow this faint trail I'd noticed the day before. It wasn't on any map I had, and it didn't look like a proper hiking route, more like a faint path that maybe deer or other animals might have worn over time. The further I went, the quieter it got. At first, I thought it was just early morning hush, but as I kept walking, even the birds seemed to vanish. It was like the forest just swallowed up all the noise. The air itself felt denser, heavier, as if I'd crossed some invisible boundary. I kept looking around, feeling more and more alert. I wasn't sure why I felt so unsettled, but something was off. It's hard to explain that feeling when you just know something isn't right, even though you can't see or hear anything specific. After maybe half an hour of slow progress along that faint path, I noticed movement to my left. Not the kind of movement you see when a squirrel darts off or a deer shifts behind a bush. This was something tall, something that didn't move like a typical forest animal. My heart did that sudden lurch thing, like it forgot how to beat for a second. I stopped dead in my tracks, my eyes scanning the thick brush, and then I saw it, or at least most of it. There was a figure standing behind some bushes, mostly hidden, but still unmistakably big. The thing was tall enough that I could see the outline of its shoulders and head above the undergrowth. It was covered in dark hair or fur, not black but a sort of deep brownish color. It stood on two legs, completely upright. Its shape wasn't like a bear's. Bears standing on hind legs usually look a bit awkward, and their bodies have a certain shape. This looked more like a broad-shouldered man, but much, much bigger and covered in hair. Its head was slightly conical at the top, or that's how it seemed to me. The arms were long and hung low at the sides. I froze, too scared to even breathe loudly. I remember my heart pounding so hard I swear I could hear it in my ears. I couldn't see the creature's face clearly, but I sensed it was looking straight at me. I tried to focus my eyes, hoping I was mistaken, thinking maybe it was just some weird formation of branches and vines. But then it moved. It tilted its head slightly, and I caught a glimpse of its eyes. They weren't glowing or anything dramatic, just dark, but there was intelligence in them. It was studying me, no doubt about it. I felt like I was the intruder, like I was somewhere I didn't belong. I remember feeling this cold sweat on my neck and the back of my knees. It's weird what your body does when panic sets in. I thought about turning and running, but somehow that felt like the worst idea. The creature didn't seem immediately aggressive, but it definitely wasn't a normal animal. I stood there, trying to keep my breathing quiet, and just waited. Maybe 10 seconds passed, or maybe a full minute, I'm not sure. Time kind of stretched in that moment. Then, very slowly, I took one tiny step backward, trying not to seem threatening or frantic. The creature took this in, then leaned forward slightly as if to get a better look. I could see a bit more of its face now. The brow was heavy, and the eyes sat deep beneath it. The hair around its face was a little thinner, so I could make out a more human-like structure than an ape's. But it wasn't human. It just wasn't. It didn't snarl or make any scary noise. There was no roaring, no dramatic charge. Instead, it began to step away, just as silently as it had appeared. It turned, revealing broad shoulders and a massive back, and moved deeper into the forest. The way it walked was fluid, surprisingly quiet for something so big. Within a few moments, it vanished into the dense vegetation. I stood there like an idiot, still not sure if I'd just hallucinated. Everything was dead quiet. It was only after it left that I realized how tense I'd been. My shoulders ached from the strain. I suddenly noticed how loud my breathing had become. I decided right then that I had to get back to my camp. I didn't want to run, but my legs were shaking as I made my way back, constantly glancing over my shoulder. Every rustle of leaves, every sway of a branch made me jump. I remember the smell of the damp earth and the way the sunlight seemed dimmer under that canopy. It felt like the forest had become a completely different place than the day before. It took me longer than I expected to return to my camp, or at least it felt that way. My mind was racing. I kept trying to rationalize what I'd seen, a misidentification, a trick of the light, something, but I knew what I saw. This wasn't a bear. It wasn't a guy in a costume either. The proportions, the subtle movements, the eyes, everything about it felt too real. I couldn't come up with a comfortable explanation. The feeling of being watched stayed with me the whole time I was making my way back. When I finally got to my campsite, I sat down on a log I'd been using as a bench and just tried to calm down. The forest felt normal here, birds chirping again, a gentle breeze rustling leaves overhead. It was as if I'd passed through some strange pocket of silence and mystery back there, and now I'd returned to the familiar world. But I couldn't shake off the encounter. I knew I should pack up and leave, but a part of me wanted to stay, to just process what happened. In the end, I decided to remain another night, but I made sure to keep my campfire going longer than usual. I didn't wander off again that day. I basically sat around, half expecting something to creep up on me. Nothing did. The next morning, I packed my stuff and headed back towards town, my mind still buzzing. I caught glimpses of normal hikers near the more popular trails, and I felt almost relieved just to see other people again. It's weird how quickly you can feel alone and vulnerable out there, even if you're just a few miles off a known trail. All the charm of Eureka Springs was still there when I got back. Cafes, shops, smiling faces. It felt surreal that just out in those woods, something I can't explain had locked eyes with me. I never mentioned it to anyone in town. I figured they'd laugh or think I was making it up. To be honest, I'm not even sure I believe it fully myself. But it happened. I know what I saw. To this day, I have no neat conclusion. I didn't find tracks or hair. I didn't see it again. It's just something that occurred in that forest. Something that left me feeling shaken and curious and very, very small. Ever since then, when I think of that trip, I remember the moment the forest went silent, and I remember those eyes looking at me. I still don't have an explanation, and maybe I never will. It's like it happened for just that brief, intense moment, and then vanished, leaving me with nothing but my own shaky memory of something big, silent, and undeniably real. Story 19. Back in 2018, I decided to get away from the city noise and head out near Alma, Colorado. I wanted a place where I could just be by myself, away from people, and Alma seemed perfect. It's not a crowded area, mostly mountains, scattered trees, and a few rough trails. Not those well-known tourist spots, just simple paths you find on old maps. I packed a tent, some basic gear, a small filter for stream water, and set out to enjoy a quiet, low-key camp for a few days. For the first day or two, everything was calm. The sky was a bright blue during the day, nights were crisp and cold. The mountains in the distance had these streaks of snow even in summer, and the forests smelled fresh, like damp earth and pine. I spent my time gathering small branches to start a fire, filtering water from a nearby creek, and just watching birds flit between the trees. It was the peace I'd been craving. I almost forgot what it felt like to be truly alone out there. No engines, no voices, just me and nature. But on maybe the third day, I decided to push a bit deeper into a valley I hadn't explored yet. It wasn't anything special on the map, just a dip between some hills. I remember the air felt different there. Not colder exactly, but heavier. There were fewer birds singing, and even the wind through the branches sounded more distant. I followed a rough trail, stepping over some fallen logs, occasionally stopping to scan my surroundings. I don't know why, but I got this uneasy feeling, like I was being watched. I told myself I was just being paranoid. This wasn't my first time camping alone, and I knew how the mind could play tricks. Then I noticed something strange on the ground. These large, uneven prints in the soil. They weren't like any boot print I've seen. No treads, too long and wide, and spaced like whatever made them had a huge stride. Next to these prints, some branches were arranged in a weird, haphazard pattern. They looked snapped and piled in a way that didn't seem natural. At first, I wondered if maybe some campers had tried to build a blind or something. But the branches weren't cleanly cut. They were twisted and broken, with splinters sticking out in odd angles. It gave me a chill. I tried to compare the size of my shoe to the print. My foot barely filled half of it. I was crouched down, examining those prints, when I saw something move just at the edge of my field of vision. I glanced up, and there it was. It stood maybe 100 feet away, partly hidden behind some thin trees. It was tall, really tall. At first, I thought it could be a bear standing on its hind legs, but it didn't have that shape. Bears are bulky and round. This thing was long-limbed, its shoulders broad, and it was covered in dark, rough-looking hair. It stood upright, perfectly still, like it was trying to decide if I was a threat. My heart started pounding so hard I felt it in my ears. I froze, one knee still bent, hand on the ground. I remember trying not to breathe too loudly. I could see its face, sort of dark, with deep-set eyes that were locked right on me. It wasn't snarling or showing teeth. It was just observing me. That's what scared me the most, I think. It wasn't rushing at me. It wasn't making any sound I could hear. It was just staring, like it was trying to figure out what I was doing there. I wanted to stand up slowly, not to spook it. My legs felt like jelly, but I managed to straighten and take a single step backward. The creature tilted its head a little, like it noticed my movement, and it almost seemed to step back too, fading just a bit more into the thicker trees behind it. The silence was suffocating. I heard a distant crow caw in the background, and that sound made me jump a bit because the tension was so high. I took another step backward, and it shifted again, still watching. Its eyes seemed intelligent, curious, but also wary. I can't explain how long this standoff lasted. Maybe 20 seconds, maybe less. It felt like an hour. Eventually, I couldn't take the intensity anymore. I took another slow step back, then another, never turning my back to it. With each step I took, it blended more and more into the dark green behind it, until I realized I couldn't see it anymore. It was just gone. 1 second I could almost make out its face. The next I was staring at an empty patch of forest. No cracking branches, no heavy footsteps, nothing. It vanished, as if it melted into the trees. I stood there, shaking, for who knows how long. Every part of me screamed to run, but I also knew that sprinting through a forest I wasn't familiar with could end badly. I tried to force myself to walk calmly, keeping my eyes peeled. I half expected it to reappear from another angle, maybe jump out when I wasn't looking. But it never did. I made it back to my campsite in this hyper-alert state, where every rustle made me flinch. When I reached my tent, I quickly packed up whatever I could. I decided I wasn't staying another night. The feeling of being watched and that strange encounter were enough to drive me away. I kept looking over my shoulder as I rolled up the tent and stuffed it into my pack. My hands were trembling, and I struggled with the buckles. I got out of there before dusk, cutting through a less dense part of the forest to hit a small dirt road that led closer to Alma. I think I only relaxed a bit once I saw a pickup truck rumble past, reminding me that there were still people around, even if they were far and few between. I never told anyone in Alma about it. I guess I just didn't have the nerve. I mean, who would believe me? They'd say it was a bear, or that I got spooked by a shadow. But I know what I saw. That wasn't a bear or a tall person in a costume. The way it moved was too fluid. The way it watched me was too... I don't even have the right words. It felt like meeting something that wasn't supposed to exist, something that belonged to another time. To this day, whenever I think back to that moment, I get this lump in my throat. I still remember the shape of its shoulders, the way the hair caught the light when it shifted, and especially those eyes. Calm, curious, but not friendly. Maybe it was just curious about me, or maybe it wanted me gone. I'll never know. After that day, I never went back to camp anywhere near Alma. I still go outdoors, but I'm more cautious about where I wander off to. I don't think I'll ever forget how helpless I felt standing in that valley, facing something I was never prepared to see. It's been years, and I still can't explain it. It showed up, scared the hell out of me, then vanished, as if it had never been there at all. Story 20. I remember that day in 2017 more clearly than I'd like to admit. I was out near Joseph, Oregon, not too far from the Wallowa Mountains. I'd gone there to clear my head, stay away from people, and just get lost in the quiet of nature for a while. It had been going fine for a few days, just me, my tent, the trails, and the lakes. I barely saw anyone else, which at the time felt like a blessing. I had been craving isolation, and I got exactly that. That morning, I left my campsite before the sun was fully up. I wanted to cover a less-traveled trail that looped through some denser parts of the forest. It was supposed to be a simple enough day: walk, observe, maybe fish a bit if I found a good spot, then head back by mid-afternoon. It's not like I was doing anything reckless. I had a map, a compass, some basic gear, and I knew how to handle myself in the wilderness. Everything seemed normal at first. The air was cool, the ground still damp from the previous night's dew, and the smell of pine was all around. I remember feeling so calm, so at peace. As I went deeper into the woods, I started noticing how still everything was. Normally, you at least hear some birds or the buzzing of insects, maybe a squirrel or chipmunk darting between trees. But this part of the forest was almost unnaturally quiet. It wasn't a gradual silence either. It was like crossing an invisible line where all the background sounds disappeared. I tried brushing it off, thinking maybe it was just the particular patch of forest, maybe the temperature shift or something else. But something about it put me on edge. My skin got that prickly feeling, and I felt this vague tension in the back of my neck. I kept walking, though, because what else was I going to do? Turn around just because it was quiet? I kept moving forward, stepping carefully, but my senses were on high alert now. At one point, I stopped to take a sip of water. When I did, I felt the presence of something. It's hard to explain. It's that feeling you get when you know someone is watching you, even if you can't see them. I turned my head slowly, scanning between the thick trunks and undergrowth. At first, I saw nothing. Just brown bark, green ferns, moss-covered logs. But then I caught a shape between the trees, maybe about 30 meters ahead. It was large, taller than any person I've seen out there. At first, I thought it might be a bear standing on its hind legs, but this silhouette was different. Thinner, more upright, with longer limbs. My heart started pounding. I remember gripping my water bottle so tight my knuckles hurt. I tried to stay calm. The figure was dark, covered in what looked like brownish-black hair, but it wasn't just a lumbering animal. It stood too naturally on two legs like a person would. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I thought about making noise, but I wasn't sure what to do. Show I'm not a threat. Or should I just back away slowly? Eventually I raised my hand halfway, just a small gesture, not even sure why I was doing it. Maybe I hoped it would understand I wasn't there to harm it. The figure didn't respond in any friendly way. It didn't approach, didn't run at me, nothing like that. Instead, it just stood still, looking at me. The quiet around us made it feel like the forest was holding its breath. My heart hammered in my chest. The creature, or whatever it was, turned its head slightly as if studying me. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I had the eerie sense it was definitely aware I was a human, out of my element. I was so scared I could feel my stomach twist. After what felt like minutes but might have been only a few seconds, it began to move off to the side. Not running, not stomping, just sort of slipping away between the trees. Its movement was quiet, almost graceful. Before I knew it, it was gone. The silence remained, heavier now because I knew I hadn't imagined it. Something that huge can't be a hallucination. I stood there, frozen, trying to wrap my mind around what had just happened. I've spent time in the outdoors before. I've seen bears, elk, deer, even the occasional wolf at a distance. Nothing compares to what I saw that day. It didn't look like an ape from a zoo. It didn't look like a man in a suit. It looked natural, adapted to that environment in a way I can't explain. I kept scanning the area, trying to catch another glimpse, but everything was still. Eventually, I started walking back. I didn't want to run. Something told me that running would be a terrible idea if it was still watching, but I did pick up my pace. Every so often I stopped and listened. Nothing. No crunch of branches, no heavy breathing, nothing to tell me it was following. That should have calmed me, but it didn't. The quiet made it worse. I felt like I was leaving some strange bubble in the forest, a place where normal rules didn't apply. As I got further away, I started hearing small signs of regular forest life again. A distant chirp, a rustling leaf. I was relieved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. My legs felt weak, and I was sweating more than I should have been considering how cool it was. I made it back to my campsite without any other incidents, but I didn't feel safe. Even at my campsite, which had felt cozy and secure before, I felt exposed. I tried to focus on normal tasks, packing some gear, checking my map, making sure I had a clear route out. But I kept glancing around, half expecting that figure to appear again just beyond the tree line. I debated whether I should just leave right then and there. Part of me wanted to pack up and drive back to town as fast as possible. Another part of me was still in disbelief. My mind came up with all sorts of rational explanations. Maybe it was just a weird optical illusion, a trick of the light, a large man wearing a heavy coat, though that made zero sense given how it moved. But deep down, I knew what I saw wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was something real, and it didn't fit into any neat category I knew. After an hour or so, I forced myself to calm down. I sat by the small fire I'd made earlier that morning and tried to eat something. I tried to distract myself by focusing on how the wind sounded in the trees, how the last rays of sunlight hit the mossy trunks, but my mind kept drifting back to that shape, the size of it, the way it stood there, staring, not afraid, not aggressive, just there. As evening approached, I decided to leave before it got dark. The idea of sleeping in that tent now felt crazy. I packed up quickly, stuffing things into my backpack without much care for organization. I kept imagining that silent presence just around the corner, waiting for me to drop my guard. My hands were shaking as I took down the tent poles. I tried to tell myself that if it wanted to hurt me, it would have done so already. But the silence around that encounter still unnerved me. Predators can be silent too when they want to be. The difference is, I never felt like prey, just completely out of my element, like I had no idea what kind of rules applied out here. Before leaving, I walked a short distance around the campsite to make sure nothing was lurking. I didn't see or hear anything unusual. If it was following me, I couldn't tell. I hiked out, my eyes darting between trees, every snap of a twig making me flinch. It took me longer than normal to get back to my car because I kept pausing, listening, and looking over my shoulder. When I finally saw that old dirt road and my car parked at the edge, my chest loosened a bit. But even as I threw my stuff in the trunk and started the engine, my hands were still trembling. Driving away felt surreal. The forest that had been so peaceful and welcoming just days before now felt strange and mysterious. I wanted to share what I saw with someone, but who would believe it? And even if they did, what would they do with that information? I ended up keeping it to myself for a long time, but the memory is as vivid as ever. To this day, I can't explain what I encountered. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe an undiscovered species, maybe just a rare sight of something that's known but not commonly seen. But nothing I know matches that shape, that size, that presence. It's not something that fits neatly into a wildlife guide. And it's not something that I ever expected to come across in real life. It's not like it attacked me or chased me. Honestly, that might have been easier to process. Instead, it just stood there, acknowledged me, then vanished as if it had never been there at all. No growls, no howls, just a heavy silence that still makes me uneasy when I think back on it. I left Joseph soon after. I couldn't enjoy the rest of the trip knowing something so strange was out there. That encounter shook me up in a way I can't fully describe. It made the wilderness feel less predictable, less catalogued. I've been camping since then, but I've never returned to that spot or anywhere near it. And I've never felt that same eerie quiet anywhere else. That day began like any other, just me and the forest, and ended with a secret I still don't know how to handle. I have no proof, no photos, no witnesses, just my memory and the sense that something out there watched me for a moment, decided I wasn't worth the trouble, and then melted back into the trees. I still wonder if it was watching me leave, hidden behind those thick trunks, as I rushed out with my heart pounding and my mind racing. I guess I'll never know. All I know is what I saw, what I felt, and how it changed the way I look at the woods. Even after all this time, I can't fully shake it off. It's a reminder that we don't have all the answers, and maybe we never will. I never saw it again, and nothing like that ever happened to me after that day. The silence I experienced still lingers in my mind, and I doubt I'll ever forget it.